We are so excited that you guys are all here. I'm Emily Kaplan. Greg Glassman and I partnered on the Broken Science Initiative because we believe science is broken. And when I say broken, we are referring to postmodern science, the science that won't replicate. Predictive value is at the core of what makes science work or fail, and we're seeing failure everywhere. We have traced the history of the philosophy of science and have identified the first major fracture happening about 100 years ago. And things have gone from bad to worse. Why this happened and what has led us here is a part of the story of the Broken Science Initiative. This is the story of science on life support. And hooked up on the beds nearby are our right to free speech, our right to assembly, our ability to critically think, and every parent's dream of giving their children an education that allows them to lead independent and free lives driven by impact and purpose. So there's a lot at stake. And it all starts with science. But I want to welcome you all first before we get into that. No matter how much or how little you know, our goal today is that you will leave here with some new ideas to think about. And as we continue to develop resources, we hope that you'll join us on this mission. Greg and I have joked over the last couple of years that we may be the only people who care this deeply about what has happened to science. And over that time, we've met other people who are thinking about this too. So I can tell you from the bottom of my heart that it is really cool that we sold out our first public event, welcoming more than 200 of you. There's people standing in the back. We should be able to get chairs for you. Sorry about that. We are all deeply committed to calling out problems that we found in this postmodern science and explaining to anyone, not everyone, which may sound familiar to some of you, how this all happened. We have a wealth of important reading curated on our website. It's brokenscience.org, and you can see we have tons of reading. And it's been carefully curated. These are all things that we've read that we feel are really important for other people to read. But in the coming weeks, we actually have a lot of really cool original content that's coming, including a podcast, some original investigations, a couple of columns, a video series, some lectures, and you'll be able to see all of the presentations today under the events page. If you haven't checked that out before, it has all of our past events that were private also. And in the coming year, we will have a Broken Science book, which we plan to turn into a school curriculum and a docuseries. And we're doing all of this because this information is too important not to share. It's also important that we remember that we're not alone. We have created these fun digital badges, which you will all get for having registered and attended this event today. So when you go on and you post a comment, which we hope you'll do, or you ask a question because there's something you don't understand, you'll have a badge next to your name. So when we have future events, you'll be able to say like, wow, that person was in Arizona way back then too, and we'll have new events for each upcoming event. I think it's really important that we remember that we're not alone. Because I think when we think about these big crises or things we don't quite understand, it can be overbearing. And we're trying to build this as a community. COVID was a crash course in the hijacking of science. But honestly, postmodern science was in the ICU long before COVID. And while the bad science showcased during the pandemic would have been enough to inspire this project, we were deeply committed to the work already. And the pandemic served as a proof of concept for the dire need of the education that we're now developing. We believe the rights of the individual are paramount in society and that free will is under attack, using postmodern science as a rationale for this encroachment. One of our mantras is when predictive value is replaced by consensus, science becomes nonsense. When I say consensus replacing predictive value, I simply mean that instead of a greater than chance predictive value, we are seeing agreement amongst experts. And that's the test of scientific result. Consensus simply means popularity. So you can see why this is all wildly dangerous. For it takes the power of validated results and it replaces it with the opinions of people who have been deemed experts. You may have noticed that we didn't put bios out for our speakers today. This wasn't an oversight. I invite you to think about how someone's academic credentials influence how you listen to them. And if you so choose, you can look up all of our speakers and you'll find a wealth of academic successes. They are experts by any conventional standard. But today, they are here because their ideas are worth listening to. We didn't put bios out because they are here for their profound ideas and work, and not because of their academic pedigrees. The expert hero worship in science has led to a void of critical thinking. And this is acutely showcased for all of us with things like the Dietary American Guidelines, cancer treatment protocols, the overprescription of statins, which you'll hear about more in depth from our speakers today, along with a long list of other casualties. And if you're not familiar with those examples, we can look at COVID as another model for consensus replacing predictive value. The experts cherry-picked data points, used models that were never designed to be predictive, to make predictions that failed miserably, and yet were not retracted or fixed. And those failed outcomes didn't seem to matter too much to a terrified and apathetic public that was being told to trust the experts and to believe in the science. But here's the thing, the science is never settled. And when you listen today to our speakers, I hope that you'll keep an open mind about what they have found in their research. It is unconventional, disruptive, and powerful, all qualities that we should be attributing to scientific discovery. They are not popular, but we think their ideas have greater predictive value than the popular alternatives. John Ioannidis, whose paper, Most Research Findings Are False, has been cited more than 10,000 times, which gave birth to what is now being called the replication crisis. In an analysis of hundreds of studies looking at genes linked to particular diseases, which happens to be one of the largest growth sectors in scientific research, in only 1.1% of all cases was the linkage found to be true. And when we look at cancer and hematology, the research is so bad that only a tiny portion can be validated. Richard Smith, who was the editor of the British Medical Journal, went even farther when he said, "The time may have come to stop assuming that research actually happened and is honestly reported, and assume that the research is fraudulent until there is some evidence to support it having happened and been honestly reported." That sounds extreme, but when we consider what happened last summer, it may not be extreme at all. Last summer, Science magazine exposed that the foundational work on amyloid beta's role in Alzheimer's was entirely fabricated. Their conclusion, the images had been doctored, literally photoshopped. This is an example of photoshopping. So Science magazine, to make sure that they had this right, hired some outside image experts to evaluate the claims. And they found even more examples of image distortion and called the work shockingly blatant and highly egregious. Let that sink in for a minute. All of the work that has followed since 2006 on Alzheimer's research is based on this early assumptive work. And it was all fake, all fabricated, photoshopped, entirely inaccurate. So, if we turn to peer review, hoping for a safeguard that this scientific misconduct would somehow be exposed or challenged or corrected, what do we find? Going on 6 months later, after Science magazine exposed this fraud, there is this tiny little note. And it is not a correction, it's not a retraction. Apparently, they're still looking into it. As Greg will explain in more detail, postmodern science uses tools of validation that are not actually validating anything. Peer-reviewed journals are not validation. They are not proving that the work was done right. Peer reviewers are not paid to investigate, check the math, or any other facts. Peer reviewers are told to assume that no fraud has occurred and that no scientific misconduct has happened. They are charged only with high-level questions and are not validating any of the results. Tom Seyfried and Malcom Kendrick will show you from a clinical perspective how broken science plays out in medicine, considering cancer research and the overprescription of statins. James Franklin and William Briggs will bring in the philosophical context to these problems, explaining both concepts and introducing you to a few of our heroes. Greg Glassman will share the tools and fundamentals of this project by clearly illustrating the difference between science and postmodern science, walking you through the definitions and the key metrics we need more people to understand. Many people have asked me, how did Greg get to this point? And the easiest way to explain it is that I think he's actually been working on these problems his whole life. His first test was recognizing that there was no definition of fitness, which led to the development of CrossFit, which was the first exercise regimen that used measurable, repeatable, and well-defined physical models to increase power outputs over time. Then Greg had the enlightening experience of being peer-reviewed. And that experience included what a federal judge has called the largest case of scientific misconduct and fraud that she had ever seen in 35 years on the bench. That showcased how the tools of consensus were being used in science to manipulate the public and serve private interests. His response to that was to form CrossFit Health, which galvanized doctors around the world to learn more about the ills of modern medicine. And after Greg sold CrossFit in 2020, he could have sailed off into the sunset, but instead he doubled down and dove into the history of the philosophy of science and found a friend in probability theory. And in the last 2 years, he and I have had some major epiphanies about why things feel so off. Why the decisions of the day are more emotional rather than rational. And why we need to do a much better job educating our children on the tools of validation, mainly predictive value. And in doing so, provide anyone interested with the confidence and the ability to critically think about the decisions that they make in their everyday lives. So, without further ado, Mr. Greg Glassman.
Thank you, Emily. Any CrossFitters in here?
Couple.
You know, I asked that because my father played a big part in my being here, like I think the rest of you, right? Wouldn't you hear without your dad? I had training in science and broken science that preceded my interest in the subject by about 45 or 50 years. And some of my earliest memories involve watching the black and white TV with the rabbit ears, no remote control, and the toothpaste commercial would come on. It'd say 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste. And my old man, without fail, would jump up, bound across the room, turn it down, and explain that there's no voting in science. The dentist he wants to hear from is the one. That innovation comes out of the dissenter, not the chorus. And these freaking commercials ran for a decade. And I know I'd see the commercial, the sense of, here goes my dad, gotta turn it down. I can see it. It's just like a 5-year-old, right? Yeah, there's no voting in science. And you know, roll the clock forward. So this is, they say, like 62 or 3, maybe 1961. I know it was June of 1967. Where I'm in a 6th grade at an open house. You know what that is? It's where your parents go to school. You dread that shit, right? So we go to school that night, and Milo Johnson is my 6th grade teacher, and he tells my dad, he says, I have a sneaky suspicion that Greg has done nothing for his science project that's due in 2 weeks. He was exactly right. I figured I'd figure something out. I put some leaves in a jar and get some bugs or something. And then put WD-40, right? So I thought I was in for it. Anything was possible after that news was broken. On the way home, my dad didn't say anything. That was making it even worse. In the morning, he didn't say anything. And I was like, I don't think he forgot. He came home from work that night, and he had a little wooden case and a bag. And he's come sit down. And he sat me down at the table, And in the wooden case was a micrometer, vernier scale micrometer. It's a little device you turn, machinists use it, and you can get a read on the length of something to a 10,000th of an inch. And he had a bag of 1,000 nails. And so he took one of the nails out, turned it down, showed me how to read it. They were 1.5 inches long. And we recorded it, the length. Then we did another one, and then another one. And he says, okay, now you go to your room and do 1,000 of these. And I want you to keep the shortest and the longest nail. I'm like, okay. So I went in my room, and I played with my army men. And I looked out the window, and I measured a nail, and I played with my army men some more. And I think this is no way I'm gonna measure 1,000 freaking nails. You know how many nails that is? So I started writing down numbers, trying to stay in the neighborhood of about 1.5 inches. And when I was done, that took 2 hours, just to fake it, right? I bring it out and give him the sheet, and he's looking at it, and he's looking at it, and he starts drawing, he's making some graphs, and he's looking at some of my points. He looks at me, he looks at the page, and I think I've gotten away with it. And he keeps looking at me, and he says, you didn't measure a damn thing. I go, yeah, I did. He goes, no, you didn't. I go, I did. He goes, you didn't. And he says, you gotta do it again. I'm like, what? So I went back to my room with the clipboard and the paper, picked up all the nails, and went in there, and you guess what I did? I closed the blinds, and I put a towel under the door, because I thought you peeked underneath me in the bushes and see me what I was doing. And it took another 1.5 hours to figure out measures in the neighborhood of 1.5 inches. And I brought it back out, and he goes, damn you. You did it again. I looked at it twice. He goes, you didn't measure anything. And I go, I did. I swear I did. And so we sat there. It took like 8 hours. And we measured these nails. And we kept the biggest and we kept the shortest. They were visibly different. And we graphed their height. And it was the most beautiful bell curve Gaussian distribution you've ever seen. Absolutely beautiful. And I was like, wow. I mean, the power of that. It was also my first exposure to scientific misconduct. Guilty. I fabricated and falsified data. And that came back again later in life, not that particular instance, but the fabrication, falsification of data, because I had that along with perjury demonstrated by the National State Conditioning Association to stop CrossFit. Now, the fitness thing, you know, I didn't like school, didn't like measuring the nails, didn't like the math. I really wasn't interested in any of that. But I like PE, I like recess a lot. And so I said, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go work at the gym. That's what I'm gonna do. And without even knowing it, I brought some baggage with me. And part of it was that in stepping into the industry, both feet, I said, let's do this. Let's define some terms and measure some shit. What do you think of that? Like, why don't we define fitness? And while we're at it, let's give it a definition that's amenable to accurate and precise estimation. Never been done before. I found the ACSM and the NSCA's definition of fitness. They had a combined statement on fitness, and Lon Kilgore, some of you remember him from our community, from the fitness world. But the ACSM definition of fitness had 35 terms, and there were things like vitality, well-being. There was only 2 that could conceivably be measured. It was power and energy, and I'm sure they didn't mean in the sense that you would be using the term scientifically. And you could tell what had happened is a committee passed the paper around and everybody got to add something, and they made that this big, long, ugly run-on sentence. It's the definition of fitness. And so what I did was I offered up that that fitness was work capacity measured across broad time and modal domains. It's doing a whole bunch of different things in a whole bunch of different durations. You can map that out, you can graph that. And I said that the theory was that constantly varying high intensity functional movement would increase work capacity across broad time and modal domains. And I put that out to the world. I defined the constantly varying high intensity functional movement as CrossFit, and I called the work capacity measured across broad time and modal domains fitness. And so we had CrossFit makes fitness. And that is what created 15,000 gyms around the world in a decade. That alone. Now, the academic response to this. I have never seen an academic criticism, or any criticism, a serious criticism, of the notion that work capacity across broad time and modal domains is the result of constantly very high intensity functional movement. And what happened when the National Strength and Conditioning Association, you may not know who that is, but the NSCA, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, the American College of Sports Medicine, billed themselves as the twin academic pillars of scientific pillars of academic exercise science. And what the National Strength and Conditioning Association did in response to constantly very high intensity functional movement was they conducted a study, and the study showed that CrossFit did wonderful things, but that 16% of the participants were hurt. And it didn't take, I knew just looking at the data that they faked it. And the deal was this: there's no way, and it was done in an affiliate, there's no way you can introduce CrossFit to a group of people and not have about 25% of them not come back. Not because they're hurt, but because no one told them that they were actually gonna have to exercise. See, the holy grail in our industry was that 10 minutes a day without perspiration, just come for an elevated heart rate, you're gonna get fit, right? And that couldn't be further from the truth. And so there's always people who just walk away, and they had no walkaways. And they had a 16% injury rate, so we called the gal that ran the gym, the guy that ran the gym, and she introduced us to the girl that conducted the study. And she's like, I don't want to lose my job at the ACSM. She was an ACSM employee, but there were no injuries. That's a lie. So we called William Kramer, who was the CEO, the head of the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and talked to him about there's problems with this study, and he said he wasn't going to do anything about it. So we filed suit. And in that suit, we eventually got our hands on emails where we actually got to see, and that took a forensic examination by a legal team as court ordered by a federal judge. And they said they had no emails responsive to our requests. We got a trove of them. And it was fascinating to actually see in real time this conspiracy to commit this fabrication, false fiction of data play out. So the study's turned in, the editor-in-chief says, there's no injuries, I won't publish this without injuries. And he says there were no injuries, and he says, and I'm not gonna publish it. And 2 weeks later, it's an email, hey, I got the injuries. And he's good, I knew you could. And it's published. So I got peer reviewed. Now the old man, it was the nails, right? My whole life I'd heard him ranting on Karl Popper, the 3 Ps, p-values, and peer review. Hated him. And then said, well, I just got peer reviewed. And it was quite a blow. They said it was the most cited study in all of exercise science ever. Now, we did that by showing everyone this abomination, and we played a big part of that in court. That tried to get hung on us as you caused this, but that didn't work. But the whole process of how this played out was so fascinating to me. And I spent the past 2 years reading David Stove, reading E.T. James, and we'll talk more about that later briefly. It's kind of a talk for another day. But one of the things in looking at broken science that's made the discussion awkward, I think, is that so many people that are weighing in on broken science, on the replication crisis, came up through that system of peer review and frequentist statistics and the whole process, they don't know the unbrokenness of it. And so the terminology I'm going to use is modern science and postmodern science. And I think that the discussion of modern science, describing what science looks like unbroken, makes it much easier to understand the nature of the break and a lot of other things about science. So what I'm going to do is walk you through here. This is the meat of the up here. I'm going to walk you through what science is, and then we're going to modern science, and we're going to take a look at the nature of what is an epistemic debasement that put it in the state that it is today. And so let's start that. I'm going to start with 4 words, 4 common words. We use them all the time, and in science they have a precise meaning. And I'll just take you through this. Observation, measurement, prediction, and validation. An observation is a registration of the real world on our senses or sensing equipment. Easy enough, right? Measurement. When that observation is tied to a standard scale with a well-characterized error, it becomes a fact or a measurement. If we map a fact to a future unrealized fact, a prediction, we get a prediction. It's a fact mapped to a future unrealized fact. It's a forecast of a measurement, and it also constitutes a model. Validation, derived from the predictive strength of the model, graded and ranked as conjecture, hypothesis, theory, and law. So, observation, registration of the real world, we tie it to a standard scale with a well-characterized error, it becomes a measurement or a fact, map that fact to another unrealized fact, and the predictive strength of it, which sounds like the probability, doesn't it? That's where the validation comes from. Let's look at conjecture, hypothesis, theory, and law. And by the way, the old man, the nails, he was head of internal research and development at Hughes Aircraft Company, and this is the way that they taught young PhDs from Caltech and from Harvard and from MIT and UCLA. They indoctrinated them as to what science was, because their finding was from recruiting the universities that there was a serious problem in engineering with what science was. So let's talk about a conjecture. Conjecture is an incomplete model or analogy to another domain. I'll give you an example of that. It's entropy, right? In fact, that's made several jumps into information theory and to probability, but an incomplete model or analogy to another domain. Hypothesis is a model based on all data in its specified domain with no counterexamples, incorporating a novel prediction yet to be validated by facts. Easy enough. And a theory is a hypothesis with at least one non-trivial data. Did an experiment and it panned out. You got the prediction. A law is a theory that has received validation in all possible ramifications to known levels of accuracy. Easy enough. Now, 5 criteria of modern science, and you can see these from what we looked at before, but the first is that modern science is the source and repository of objective knowledge. Number 2, this knowledge silos and models graded and ranked by their predictive strength, conjecture, hypothesis, theory, and law, right? Third one, models are a forecast of a measurement. And 4, predictive strength is the sole determinant of validation. In fact, validation and method are entirely independent. And the line was that the theory, whether it comes from inspiration or perspiration, has validity on its predictive strength, and nothing in method invalidates it. It could have come from a dream, you could have found it in a notebook in an alley, or it could have been through hard work over many years. Let's talk about the philosophy of modern science, and then I'm going to share the epistemic debasement. We're going to move towards the break here. Modern science is inductive, and as the conclusions come from premises with probability and not certainty. It's the probability of the hypothesis given the data is bracketed between 0 and 1, not including, right? Versus true or false. The demarcation of science from non-science is the predictive power of the models of science, and someone very famously got that horribly wrong. In fact, when Popper said it was falsification, it was Thomas Kuhn that says, I don't think that's right. That doesn't settle what you set off to answer, which was that you needed a demarcation that could differentiate astronomy from astrology. and falsification doesn't. Third, the inexorable march of scientific progress is the improved predictive strength of its models. 4, predictive strength is the sole source of rational trust of modern science. The sole source, the predictive strength. I've come to realize that all trust comes from predictive strength. You trust your insurance company on its predictive strength. Your insurance company trusts you on your predictive strength. We trust our spouse, or your spouse trusts you, you trust your kids on the predictive strength. It's a very simple concept. Let me show you what happened to this. In academic science, and we can show you who did this next, the probability of a hypothesis is meaningless. A hypothesis is a proposition, and it only has values true or false. Popper chose falsification as a demarcation between science and nonsense. Falsification is necessary but not sufficient. It's odd because he got this, I believe, from A.J. Ayres, and Ayres was part of the Vienna Circle, and Ayres had offered up falsification as a requirement for a meaningful assertion. That for something to have meaning, it had to be conceivably falsified. The third one, the inexorable march of scientific progress, is the improved predictive strength of models. What it becomes from what we're calling the irrationalists is the denied progress and the improved reliability of revised theories or models. Thomas Kuhn said that the new theory with the new paradigm shift isn't a better one, it's just a new one. But he does mention that scientists will test the proposition, and when it doesn't meet their predictions, they might want to throw it out. He got so close, but he couldn't do it. Predictive strength is the sole source of rational trust of modern science. Becomes in postmodern science. Predictive strength has been replaced with null hypothesis, significance testing, and peer review, producing an enormous body of science that will replicate. I want to give some credit and blame for where this happened, how this shift came. And I'll just share this. On the subject of prediction, I spent a lot of time looking at prediction and our interest in it, and I kind of put this list together, and I would have shared this sooner, but I haven't had the energy to memorize these freaking things. But grab any one of them and look it up. I won't give you the slides, but it's crazy. Everything from scaring birds and watching which way they fly, and that would suggest something about the planets. I mean, just crazy stuff. And I added some things to the list here. I put, I think I've got consensus science in here, right? Yeah, haha. And then I put modern science in here. And I suggest that that's the only one of these that's ever panned out and never been able to predict anything. This is how strong our desire for prediction is, that people have been searching for methods for reliable prediction forever and in all cultures. There are 4 philosophers of science, Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, and Feyerabend, and their grip on academia is complete. Now, you can look at Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, and Feyerabend and come up with some rather profound distinctions from them, but it really misses the point. And I use the example, it'd be like talking about Charles Manson and how different he is from John Wayne Gacy, how different he is than Jeffrey Dahmer, and never covering the fact that they're all 3 serial killing murderers. And what these guys have in common, on top of their differences, is that they all took Hume's inductive skepticism to heart and believed that reliable knowledge couldn't come from induction. And so they put this thing on a deductive footing, and there it's remained maintained in academia. Hume, by the way, gets kind of an odd pass, it seems, even from our friend David Stove. And Hume said that you couldn't get certain knowledge from induction. Well, that's exactly the point. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't return ones and zeros. You get 0 to 1 bounding. So David Stove wrote brilliantly. His whole career, it's fundamentally all he did, it seemed, was write on these 4 people that he called irrationalists, and I think it's a perfect fit. My dad thought it should be post-modern. He didn't think it quite met the tenets of postmodernism, but I think that anything goes kind of culture is consistent there. But I can't recommend enough reading David Stove, because I think he gives all the reason you need not to spend too much time with Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Lakatos, or Feyerabend. And there are things I can say nice about these guys, but I am going to give them credit for the schism, for the break. Let's look again. Now, these guys, these are my frequentists that are responsible for, that's not fair to say. It is claimed that null hypothesis significance testing has its origins in those works. That's not really what had happened. What happened was that academic publishers of statistics books and psychology texts took the brilliant work of Ronald Fisher, of Aragon Pearson, and Jerison Neyman, and combined it into null hypothesis significant testing in a manner that we know they all three would have been very much unhappy about. It violated the tenets of null hypothesis significance testing, violated some hard stated rules of each of those mathematicians. So and it's Gerd Gigerenzer from the Max Planck Institute that has a series of papers. He's kind of like David Stover. For 20 years, he's been saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. With this null hypothesis testing, the significance testing has led us astray, creates overcertainty. Now, these are the guys that developed a philosophy of science that doesn't have null hypothesis significance testing. It doesn't mention anything about peer review. And we start with Laplace. We've got Jeffries here, Richard Cox, Claude Shannon, George Pauly, and E.T. James. What's interesting about these philosophers of science is that they were first and foremost world-class scientists with strong feelings, strong views on the philosophy of science. It's really not what we have on the other side. Okay, I put together some questions. I'm going to say frequently asked because we haven't been doing this enough. There are questions that should be asked, and I thought we could just rip through here. It'd be kind of fun to do. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But what do you mean by broken? We've been talking about broken science for a long time, and I haven't been asked what I mean by broken. You need to be asked. And what I mean by broken is won't replicate. So that's easy enough. Let's go to the next one. Becoming what? So broke, what's it become? Perverted, unreliable, corrupt, deviant, postmodern, irreplicable, trustworthy, shitty. It's not working. And by the way, I&I's most research findings are false. I can improve that work, just make it most research findings are improbable, right? Even there, the truth and falseness of it, looking for that 0 or 1, and what happens? Matt, you work up to the magic number, and it's true, right? Number 3, what part of science was broken? The validation criteria, predictive strength of the hypothesis replaced with publication in special magazines, and null hypothesis significance testing. That's what was changed. Where's broken science found? At universities worldwide. The natural sciences are negligibly affected, whereas the social sciences and medicine are hobbled by broken science. Number 5.
You just cut that corner.
When did the break occur? As good a date as any would be 1934, with Popper's publishing of the logic of scientific discovery. And there Popper denies induction and offers falsification. We're off to the races. Number 6, where? And the answer is, from Vienna to the rest of academia, broken science is found in peer-reviewed literature or research performed at universities. I say Harvard and not Intel.
He walks right into that frame. So
Industrial science is largely unfazed by this. The greatest phase is interacting with the university and recruiting people. There are fields like pharma, though, that have been tainted. They found it's easier now to get a good p-value, right? And to get university professors to give a thumbs up or Photoshop your results. You know, in the Photoshopped Western blots, the great line was, there's no disease Photoshop can't cure. I love that. How? Hume's inductive skepticism seemed to dictate a deductive framework for the scientific method. It was the desire for certainty that pushed Popper in that direction. And it's taken a considerable amount of brilliance to make sense of uncertainty. And Matt Briggs here has, I think, done a better job of that than anybody. I would add you to the list of those great people, Matt, but you're still alive, so you have to wait. And who broke it? Popper, Kuhn, Lucados, and Feyerabend philosophy of science and textbook publishers who fused the work of Fisher, Neyman, and Pearson to form null hypothesis significance testing. By the way, null hypothesis significant testing isn't a part of statistics. Number 9, producing a vast body of science that won't replicate. Number 10, how much of academic science won't replicate? Well, that's not really known. Most of it is a safe bet. Ionati said most research findings are false, and that came from an Amgen attempted replication of 53 studies deemed landmark in preclinical oncology and hematology. After a decade and spending $1 billion, 6 of the 53 studies can be replicated. And again, the natural sciences are negligibly impacted. I want to share this because it's very important. We don't know of the 53 studies, we don't know which they were. We don't know which 6 were good. They weren't retracted, they still stand today. Entire fields of medicine have been developed from these 53 studies. One of the papers has been cited 5,000 times since being found to not replicate. Now, your oncologist may be scientific in the way she administers your treatment, but the treatment may be effective, but it doesn't have it, and maybe more likely it's not effective. But what it wasn't done, it wasn't developed scientifically. The field's poison, tainted. Clinical trials were conducted off of these studies, and a lot of them. So that means people were exposed to things based on a fraud. Number 11, what will it take to fix it? That's not gonna happen. I can't imagine it. I said that's not going to happen, but change would seem impossible absent recognition of the problem. And we had in CrossFit Health, we'd said, let's start with the truth. And the Latin for that is incipiamus veritate. And what I can tell you is that I don't think it's going to get better, but it doesn't seem even remotely possible that it will get better if we're not honest about what's wrong. Yeah. And so that would be the first step in any case. Number 12, is there an alternative to null hypothesis significant testing? Let me give you just one. And I said, answer, of course, the practice is unknown in industry and not found in the field of statistics. Briggs, Nguyen, and Trafamau is the replacement for hypothesis testing 2019. And Springer's structural changes and their economic modeling, econometric modeling, offers an elegant and powerful proposition of it. This is a quote from the work. Returning to an old idea, making direct predictions by models of observables, assessing the value of evidence by the change in predictability, and then verifying the predictions of reality. I said, imagine that. That's like, I can tell you that works. That works. Why? Because it's what science is. 13, what's wrong with p-values? There's nothing inherently wrong with the concept. The problem is the pervasive misinterpretation leading to an epidemic of over-certainty in academic science. A fellow named Oakes asked a whole bunch of students in statistics and psychology, research assistants, professors, went through the whole gamut of academics and students that should be skilled, should know something about p-values. In the study, they asked people to identify which of these was true or false. The first one, you've absolutely disproved the null hypothesis with a weak p, a p of 0.01, false. You found the probability of the null hypothesis being true, false. You have absolutely proved your experimental hypothesis, false. You can declare the probability of the experimental hypothesis being true, no you can't. You know if you decide to reject the null hypothesis, the probability that you're making the right or wrong decision, no you do not. You have a reliable experimental finding in the sense that if hypothetically the experiment were repeated a great number of times, you'd obtain a significant result on 99% of occasions. That too is false. Now, what percentage of those that were asked which of these are true were able to say they're all false? It was 3%. 3% could actually say, yeah, none of those are true. And it's really easy to do. anything that claims to be shedding light on the hypothesis is going to be false, and anything that's off uncertainty is going to be false. The p-value only speaks to the probability of the data given the hypothesis. It has nothing to say on the probability of any hypothesis. In 1966, a fellow named Backett and then later Thomson in 96 and 99 added to this list, and this is just a fun list to run through. A p-value is the probability that the results will replicate if the study is conducted again. False. We should have more confidence in p-values obtained with larger n's than smaller, so it's actually backwards. With a big enough sample space, with a big enough n, p-values are always going to be low. A p-value is a measure of the degree of confidence in the obtained result. False. A p-value automates the process of making inductive inference. False. You still have to do that yourself, and most don't bother. 5, significant testing lends objectivity to the inferential process. It really doesn't. A p-value is an inference from population parameters to our research hypothesis. It is not. A p-value is a measure of confidence we should have in the veracity of our research hypothesis. That again is false. A p-value tells you something about the members of your sample. No, it doesn't. A p-value is a measure of the validity of the inductions made based on the results. That is false. A p-value is the probability that null is true or false given the data. It's not. A p-value is the probability the alternative hypothesis is true or false. This is false. And a p-value is the probability that the results obtained occurred due to chance. And he says this is very popular, but nevertheless false. The complaints about p-values and null hypothesis significant testing have been, it's a 60, 70 years story now. And the constancy, it's not changing, it's not evolving. They were wrong 60 or 70 years ago. They're still wrong today. And there's been really no change. To whose advantage? The broken science. Academia, with the explosion of new sciences, scientists, published research and researchers. I think 10-year labs, grants, staff, and fame are the rewards for shitty science. That's it. So what broke? Validation was flensed in academic science from the scientific method. The impossibility or the view that a hypothesis, the probability of a hypothesis not having meaning cripples the process. It's over at that point. And you're left with that true or false nonsense. And what role does corruption play? I like this one. There's two definitions of corruption. One is kind of dishonesty for personal gain. Almost all dictionaries have this. The second one is something made unreliable by alteration, like a corrupted file. And what my contention is that the epistemic debasement of modern science created unreliable science that attracted industry and others to practice every manner of scientific misconduct for personal gain. Peer review and weak p-values are readily jiggered for cash. And I gotta tell you, it would be much easier to convince a dean of a new theory of the origins of sex and gender than it would be to sell a rocket fuel to Elon that doesn't work. I can promise you that. And 16. What is the funniest thing you ever said at p-values? This is it. I absolutely love it. An hypothesis that may be true is rejected because it failed to predict observable results that have not occurred. This seems a remarkable procedure. And that was Sir Harold Jeffreys, actually, in 1939, not James. Someone goofed that up. So that's it. That's what you do. Do you get anything from that?
So my talk is uncertainty, and this is what we need more of in science. We've already heard two great talks that describe that we have too much certainty. We have a pandemic of over-certainty, if you like. And so what we really need is a return of greater uncertainty. And I'm going to kind of try to prove this to you today in a little bit, in a little way. Try to bolster the talks we just heard a little bit too. So this is 3 pictures here. The upper left is from a early Air Force Navy cryptography a piece of cryptography equipment, electronic cryptography. So what's that? Everybody knows what cryptography is. You put your password in the websites and so forth, and the data is encrypted and all this kind of thing. So what does that mean? The data is encrypted. So when you send something out over the web, or you log into your bank site or something like this, everybody along the line can see the data that's out there. The data that passes between your computer and the bank's computer, for instance. And if I saw that data, and I was able to then use that data in some fancy way through some computer model, and I was able to predict what was actually in that data, well then I would be able to break your password, I would be able to see what you have, I would see your secret knowledge. So this is an interesting thing about randomness, which we'll come back to. Now I was also a weather forecaster. I was doing atmospheric physics. I was very interested in climate models and marrying climate models to other models, and global warming was a big thing. I started off as a global warming believer, and when I was a graduate student doing dynamical meteorology and the like, and I became quickly a skeptic for lots of reasons we can talk about. And for a while I was briefly a professor of medicine, not of medicine, in the Department of Medicine, a professor of biostatistics at Cornell. And I was a mentalist, a professional mentalist. And so what is a mentalist? A mentalist is someone who tries to read your thoughts, or have you be able to read my thoughts. And I was performing this on Las Vegas, on the Las Vegas Strip for a conference of engineers. Max Brooks opened for me. He was this is true story, he was the guy who wrote the World War Z, Mel Brooks' son. Have you heard of that book, that kind of stuff? This was a conference of engineers and so forth. And what I was trying to teach them is how to build scientific models and how to understand uncertainty and all that kind of stuff that we're doing here today too. So I wanted to demonstrate how I could do that. So what I did was I handed out my business card, and they took it in the audience, and 5 people took it. And I asked them, my back was turned, I couldn't see what they were doing, and I asked them, since this was Las Vegas, I said, write down your favorite card, whatever, ace of spades, 2 of hearts, whatever you like. And then somebody collected the cards, they brought them up to me, and then I started asking the people, I knew who basically where the cards were handed out and so forth, and I started asking people questions. I didn't say, what was your favorite card? Nothing simple like this, but questions that kind of probe their psychology and infer from that a model of what I think the best, because I had the cards in front of me, I had the cards, I saw that someone picked the 3 of clubs and so forth. And so by asking carefully selected questions, I was able to discern exactly who picked which card. I identified all 5 correct. And you can calculate the probability of this, and it's kind of low and everything, and it seems remarkable. So I thought, because it's so important in science, of course, to build theory and models and the like, I thought we'd do something similar to that today here. Except I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to have you guys be the scientists, and you're going to try to probe my mind. So I'm going to do it's very simple. It's not perplexing or anything like this. But I'm going to think of a number between 1 and 5. Let me write it down so I don't forget it, because my memory is terrible. And what I want you to do, and I've kind of given I did it on purpose this way, because I've kind of given, I'm going to write it down. This is just so I don't change my own mind. Let me give it to somebody here in the audience. Don't peek at this, hide this under your cell phone. Well, I want to make sure I have it right. So, I've kind of given, on purpose, maybe you didn't notice, maybe you did, but I've kind of given you signals to tell you the number that I've already picked. And I want to know, has anybody picked up on this? Anybody have a guess?
2.
Yes, sir. 2. Okay, why 2? You saw me right 2.
That's a hell of a signal.
Anything else? What do you think? So now you have a model, you have some evidence, right? And so now what do you think the chances that you're making a prediction, right? Because we don't know what it is yet, so what's the chance that that's correct? Based on your model. You don't have to come up with an exact number, of course you can't, but maybe 20%. Why 20%? 1 out of 5, okay. That's a model 2. That's a model 2, but you seem more certain than that. 100%. That, would you bet your life on it? I mean, that's a pretty big risk right there, 100%. Maybe modify that a little bit. Anybody else have a different number? What do you buy? Three. Why three?
But you had 3 pictures at the beginning.
3 pictures at the beginning. So what's your guess of the odds of 3?
My wife's the mathematician.
Approximately. Good. That's good. When you don't know, don't say you know. That's our first lesson right there. If we had more of that in science, we'd be doing a lot better job. Anybody else? We have 2 and 3. Any other numbers? 5. Why 5?
Because you told 2 stories with the number 5.
Okay. What do you think the chances are? 50%. Okay. Well, now the big reveal. Could you read the number out, please? 1.7. I said a number between 1 and 5. This is a number between 1 and 5. So we all were able to form models. We all made predictions. We had all the same available data. None of us thought, in that sense of data, we're able to complete the thought of what that means. All of your guesses were good and correct based on the evidence that you had. I did fake it too. Yes, I did. It looked like a 2, but it wasn't a 2. So you can make up misread observations. It's very easy. This is what I wanted to show you. Is that in science, and this is a scientific experiment, just like the most sophisticated one we could run. We form these hypotheses, we make our measurements, and we come to these theories, and we're pretty confident in these theories. Not 100% perhaps, that's going overboard, but 50%. We all have these kinds of guesses, and that's how easy it is to go wrong in science. So if we can go that wrong over something so simple, imagine when we do have these complex sort of questions in front of us, how badly we could do it. Now, before you knew the outcome, I say the outcome was random. Random, meaning unknown. You didn't know exactly what it was. You had some guesses, you had some theories and so forth. But it was random. So that's what random means. It means unknown. So I want us to think of some other outcomes in our lives, or common occurrences or common things that you can think of that are random. And we've all heard the term, so maybe you think of something you've seen before that's random. Anybody? Golf swing? Sure, why not? In fact, the first ordnance tests of the United States Army with their ordnance range, they called those shots random for just that reason. I'm thinking things like a coin flip. We all think a coin flip is random. Things like a coincidence.
Dice.
What's that? Dice, perfect, yes, exactly. Casinos make use of these kinds of things. So this is a picture, this is a genuine picture from the town in which I grew up, which is the same town Claude Shannon grew up.
Wow.
Very small town in northern Michigan. My high school graduating class size was 30. I was number 29. Sister Dorothy was merciful and let me pass. And my very first job was on this street in high school, randomly. So that's a coincidence, right? So the coincidence is kind of a random thing too. So let's think about these. Okay, so this is a true story too. So Carl Jung, the philosopher, had on his couch a woman who was being psychologized. And she was telling him of a dream she had of a scarab beetle. And as she was relating this dream, there was a scratching at the window. And Jung went over to the window and opened it up, and in flew a scarabid beetle, landed on his hand. So that's an amazing coincidence. So that's a random, some people would say, hey, that's random. So what do we mean by that? Now we need to understand that, because that seemingly simple thing is the tie between why all the science is bad and what we should do about correcting it. It doesn't seem like it perhaps at first, but I hope to demonstrate that it is true. And there we go. So I got this off of Twitter last Thursday or Friday, I can't remember which day. And apparently this is true. The past 8 teams to lose to the Super Bowl, lose the coin toss while they're winning the game. Now, I don't know what happened on Sunday. I didn't see it, so I don't know. Who?
Chiefs won the toss and won the game.
They won the coin toss and they won?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so we've already falsified this kind of. But there it is, right there. So what? Before this is happening, before the game, we might have thought to ourselves, well, why is that? We can easily invent stories why that's the case. Well, we're starting out as the underdogs in a sense. We're having to kick off, and the other guys get the ball first. So now we got to work harder. Our spirits are larger. Maybe that's why they were winning. So you could tell yourself these theories really, really simply. You could, just like we were doing with the number guessing thing, you could come up with theories quite easily to fit the available data. And so I would say this is a coincidence. And so was Young's beetle a coincidence. So we have different ideas about what a coincidence means. I know. Okay. So let's think about this. And that was a coin flip, and we mentioned coin flips as being one thing we think is random. This is a picture of one of my advisors at Cornell when he was at Cornell, Percy Diaconis. He's a very famous, world famous mathematician. And he was the guy who discovered that it takes 7 shuffles of a deck of cards to make the order unpredictable. And he's very interested in these same kinds of subjects. He was very interested in mentalism and magic, and so in the same way that I was very eagerly his student. So he was very interested in coin flips in particular. What makes a coin? Yes, sir. That's what I do. Yes, there we go. Who could have predicted that? See? Now, Percy, we all know we all guessed the coin flip probability that's a model. A probability comes from a model. So we all guessed this model, the coin flip of being 50-50. Seems a reasonable thing. But why? Well, because when we've had our experience of flipping coins, we can't really predict what the outcome's going to be. But if you happen to know some friendly engineers at Stanford University, you could have them build this little machine right here, which Percy had them do. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see somebody's hand there. If you press a lever, I know you can't really recognize it, but if you press this lever right there, the coin will flip, go up in the air, spin, rotate a number of times, and it'll land in this cup, this little orange cup right there. Every time, heads, without exception.
What?
Why? Because the coin flip is just a mechanical motion. When you're flipping the coin, you impart to it a certain amount of momentum and a certain amount of spin. And if you knew what these were and you knew the equations of motion, it's really not difficult at all to predict the outcome with certainty. Aha. So we have proven that we have 2 models, one which I have no idea how much force and spin I'm giving the thing, and the outcome is 50-50. And another is I do know, and the outcome is certain. So probability and modeling, probability depends on your model. Your model changes, the probability changes. This is another reason why we should not use p-values, we'll see. Because there is no unique probability. Things only have probabilities when we assign premises to them, when we give them some kind of a model. Speaking of coincidences, it was Young's idea. He has a whole book of these things. He called them synchronicity. And Percy and Fred Mosteller, coincidences, they have pretty much the same definition. So when events happen, more than 2 events happen at the same time, and they have a seeming connection, but we can't identify a cause between them. So for instance, it's really weird, isn't it, to be sitting there hearing a dream about a beetle, a scarab beetle, and then here comes a scarab beetle at the window. So Young called this synchronicity in the sense that it's an acausal principle that brings things together. But I think that's the wrong word. Basically what he meant by that was something had caused the woman's dream. Of course, something did cause the woman's dream. Something caused the beetle to be at the window at that particular time. So the idea that makes it weird to us is that this thing happened together. And so we can't help but posit, the woman dreaming didn't cause, the woman's relating the tale of her dream didn't cause the beetle to come to the window in any sense. But maybe there was some other cause, some cause further back. In this causal chain, maybe the Lord himself wanted this to happen, that the woman was going to give this story and the beetle would show up. That's the kind of thing that I think we could call synchronicity. When we suspect that there's this distant tying cause that might exist, but we can't prove it. And this is all relevant to science. It doesn't seem like it at first, but I'm gonna prove it to you that it does. As opposed to, in English, sometimes coincidence, we use coincidence, we say that's a coincidence, in a strange kind of a way when we mean that there's some identified cause that binds these events together. And sometimes we mean, just like the coin flips about the Super Bowl outcomes, maybe it's just two events that are happening together that have no causal connection whatsoever, but we don't assign one, we don't even seek them out, because we know that there's no causal connection. So it all ties back to cause. So we're always interested in cause. This is getting back to the idea of statistical significance. In statistics, the word significance doesn't mean what it means in English at all. It's a brilliant move for them to use the word, but it doesn't mean anything. It means we p-value. And we p-value means significance. It's a circular definition. When your p-value is not we, when it's large, you say the results are explainable by chance alone, which is kind of the American or the English version of coincidence, where you don't think there's any kind of causal tying principle together. The problem is, we'll come to the problem. The problem is this. There's lots of papers out there, you can read just endless numbers of papers. They say, well, these results can't be due to chance. These results can't be due to chance. What do they mean? Or these results are due to chance or caused by chance. It becomes like Gerd Gigerenzer says, a sort of ritual. And there's almost a belief that chance itself has causal powers. That Fortuna herself is out there causing certain things that we can't predict. So this is what chance is. I mean, we're leading up to this and to how science goes bad. So chance just is unpredictability. We saw in the coin flip that if we knew the physics of the thing, it was perfectly predictable, and there's no chance about it. And when we don't know the outcome and we don't know the cause, well, then we're more likely to ascribe things to chance. So chance is unpredictability, which is a synonym of ignorance, which just means what random means. That's it. So in other words, to sum it all up even shorter, chance is unknown cause. When we don't know the cause, or all of the causes, many things have lots of causes, and cause itself is very difficult to understand, but understanding cause is the true goal of science, to know why something happened, when it did, and how it did. We want to understand the cause. Okay. So when we don't know it, we ascribe things to chance, which is not the right thing. It just means we don't know what caused things. So in logic, we have a well-known phrase, and it's true. Correlation does not imply causation. All right? Another way to say that is coincidence. And the English phrase we're kind of using in the Diaconus Mosfelder kind of way. Coincidence does not imply causation. Right? Simple. That's absolutely true. But the ritual inside statistics, when all that stuff about p-values boils down to, is that suddenly we throw coincidence out the window. We say, no, this has to be causation because Fauci's P is we. That is exactly what is happening. It is a fallacy. Every use of a p-value is a logical fallacy. It's never right. Not ever, not once, not for any reason. It could be that in this case that you used a p-value and it was we. It turned out you did identify causality correctly. It's possible, yes. But a lot of times it turns out to be absolutely wrong. Like the models we had about the number that I was guessing. We all had pretty confident guesses. The chances at least 1 in 5, right? 20%, something like this. No. It's not that way at all. So this is the real problem right here. It's mistaking correlation for causation, and this happens all of the time, all of the time. And so, what do? Well, what does it lead to? It leads to things like this. This was going around the internet, it periodically resurfaces. This is what the kind of science that is being practiced out there now leads to. These are all headlines from the Daily Mail. The first one's from January 2019. 1 egg a day lowers the risk of type 2 diabetes. The second headline, about 2 years later, eating an egg a day increases your risk of diabetes. Both of these were produced by science, by studies that determined the correlation they had in their models. The correlation of their data and their model was identified as causation. And so we get these contradictory headlines. So what do? Do you eat an egg or you don't? You don't know. You can't tell from this. And this amazes people, but this is exactly the kind of thing that happens if you assume your correlation is indeed causation. I got a whole collection of these. I won't bore you with all of them. I'll just kind of show you one or two. Chocolate is bad for your heart. That's on January 2012. And by April 2012, they use the same damn picture. This is also the Daily News. Eating chocolate turns out now to be good for your heart. I don't know what the case is, whether our other eminent speakers will tell me whether or not chocolate's any good. I don't know. But they both can't be true. So we have a fundamental disconnect here. So we have proven to ourselves, at least in these cases, it can't be true that egg both raises and lowers your risk for diabetes, and it can't be true chocolate is bad and good. It can't be true that vitamins are both bad and good. Vitamins increase your risk of disease. Vitamins are bad, are good for you. Vitamins are bad for you. And this one, this is kind of fun. This first one is 21 May 2012, and the second, 5 days later. Of course, reporters don't know. They'll just put everything they get. They're just shoving this stuff out there, and no one remembers what happened a week ago anyway. But I go on. That one was dairy. Dairy is good for you. Dairy is bad for you. I got a whole collection of these things, and you can find them yourself. Just go to like scholar.google.com or something like this, and type in anything you like, whatever disease you like, and whatever cure or common thing, chocolate, coffee. Sometimes coffee is good for you, sometimes it's bad for you. Now it's coffee with milk is good for you, but coffee alone is not good for you. Who knows? So why? Well, again, it's because people identify that the correlations they have seen, they declare are causation. And nobody checks. Nobody checks. That's the replication bias. That's the entire thing. And in fact, that's what Greg was showing you with all the necromancy and nephromancy and all these kinds of things. They noticed certain things that sometimes happen. They have these coincidences. And they built models based on that, and they become science of the day. It's exactly the same thing they did. We read these stories and we think ourselves so superior to these ancients who didn't know what they were doing when they were screening and so forth. We're doing exactly the same thing. We're just doing it in Excel. There's no difference. There's no difference between them and us at all. Their goals were noble. They were trying to decide, should we go to war today or something like this. Here we're trying to say, should I have an egg or not? This is so pathetic. So this is what happens here. We have, this is exactly what happens. We're trying to design these experiments and everything, and we're aiming at reality. That's the hope. We're trying to figure out how the world works. But a lot of times when we shoot these evidential arrows, if you like, and we can come running over to those things, and we can create a model around them real easy. It's just super easy to do. I mean, this is the real problem. There's too many scientists doing too much science, and science is too easy. It's too simple. Anybody can program this stuff in their computers now. Models can squeeze into any size set of genes. You can take your data that you have, and you can squeeze it into any favorite model that you have. And we did this at the very beginning. We did it to ourselves, and we were trying to guess what number I picked. We took the data that we have, and we squeezed it into a model, the wrong model for all of us. But that's just how simple it is. The images from that old Geico commercial, I always love this because this woman's trying to squeeze into this dress. It was an old, remember those Geico commercials, going with Geico save you money or something like this, and the guy says, is Abe Lincoln honest? And this Mary Todd character, she says, does this dress make my behind look good or look fat? And Abe is, laughs and she storms off. But that's the key. So he was a good scientist. He was reluctant to admit what the data had showed him, but in the end he did. But nowadays, a lot of people, a lot of scientists, especially in the politics that we have today, where they're not going to go against the consensus in any field, especially when the data is obviously bad. So they're going to either not publish or they're going to manipulate the data in such a way that they can make it fit. It's just too easy to make data fit into models. It's simplicity itself, it really is. So the reason they do it is this. Many scientists do know that they're after cause. They're after the description of nature. They want to say how the world works, okay? Not the ones that are cheating and all this kind of stuff, but the honest scientists, which comprises the bulk of them. They want to say how the world works, and so they build these models, and they say the model explains the data well. They say the model explains the data well, and they talk themselves into this is so important that this becomes a fundamental goal of science for them, explaining their data well. But if the model explains the data well, but the model makes wrong predictions, then what the model is explaining is not reality. It's not explaining reality, it's only explaining the modeler's biases, okay? That's where we've gone wrong in science. That's how easy it is to go wrong, because we've made science such a routine, regular thing that anybody can become a scientist. It takes almost no training and effort, and there's tons of funding out there. There's just too much science. There's too much of it. There's too much of it being done, and there's too much of it being lorded over us. This is why it's so easy for people to pick the science they want you to follow. That's why they're always saying, listen, follow the science, when they always mean, follow me, follow me. So, and I want to echo what Greg said. What's the cure? What's the fix? There isn't one. I mean, we could make some of us more aware of these kinds of the things that we've done here and we're doing here today, but the enterprise is just too big. It's a behemoth. It's Leviathan, trudging forward. There's no way with our efforts we're going to stop it. But with hope, we can build a remnant up who at least understands the real problems that we're having. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.
I must speak about David Stone, who was my mentor in philosophy, and especially his work on probability and rationality of science. Like myself, he was an Australian. We speak a version of English that you don't hear on television very much. I hope you can tune into it. I'll speak briefly about his life in a moment, but you won't be motivated to listen to that unless you have some idea of the basics of what he said. So first, here are a few of his take-home messages. First, the probabilistic nature of evidence to conclusion is logic. That means that in cases like whether an accused is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, or the evidence that, whether the Big Bang hypothesis is credible on the evidence, it's an absolutely objective matter how well supported the theory is by the evidence. That is the probability of the theory on the evidence. Different people may have different views, but if so, one is right and the others are wrong. Secondly, deductivism, the thesis that the only logic is deductive, is evil, as Greg has said earlier. It's been common to think that deductive logic, as in mathematics, that moves with certainty from premises to conclusion, is the only logic, and that there's no such thing as the probabilistic logic that I've just briefly described. And follows from that the philosophy of science of Popper, Kuhn and others is a disaster. Those thinkers dominated philosophy of science in the mid-20th century, and they were deductivists, so in reality they undermined the rationality of science. And next, Stowe argues that induction is justifiable by the logic of probability. Induction means inference from the past to the future, or generally from the observed to the unobserved, or from sample to population. It's been a long-standing philosophical problem as to if and why it's justified. Stowe offers a solution. He said some other things. He had controversial views such as a deep, in-principle political conservatism, an argument that women are on average less intelligent than men, and opposition to some parts of the theory of evolution, but they are not so relevant to today's topic, so I won't be talking about those. This is his most prominent book in 2 versions, attacking Popper and Kuhn's philosophy of science. Well, briefly about his life. David Stowe was born in rural New South Wales in 1927 and attended Sydney University in the late 1940s. He was much influenced by the dominant figure in Australian philosophy, John Anderson, and took up philosophy as his life profession. He married and had 2 children, both now successful writers. There are not many photos of him. He's shy of the camera, but here is one of him mowing, real mowing, in 1956, and another one of him and his wife Jess in the middle, and another friend in the 1970s. Well, then, up in the 1970s, he wrote his first book, Probability in Hume's Inductive Skepticism, which identified deductivism as the error in the hugely influential arguments of the 18th century philosopher David Hume that induction is not justified. I studied with him in 1973, and he kindly gave all of us students typescripts of his book. Being in a humanities faculty in the 1970s and 80s was of course a severe trial for anyone of conservative inclinations, and Sydney University philosophy was among the worst departments for political trouble. He survived, but not easily. When he took early retirement in 1986, his parting shot was an essay, Farewell to Arts, which began like this. Yes, indeed. And interesting that the next few sentences continue like this about science. He says, well, his problem is not there in science. So I wish you were back today to see if he would repeat that, or think things had gone down the tube in science as well. I'm not sure if he'd say that today. In the meantime, he'd written the book I mentioned earlier, Popper and After, 4 Modern Irrationalists, attacking the deductivist errors of Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos and Feyerabend. He continued to write in retirement, notably a book Darwinian Fairy Tales, about the logical flabbiness of the sociobiology approach to evolution. This is a picture of him late in life, looking rather severe, which is typical. Sadly, he was a heavy smoker and developed esophageal cancer. A major operation left him severely depressed, and he committed suicide at age 66. Now, let me explain in a little more detail the basics of his ideas, in concentrating on the more positive ones rather than the polemics against Popper and others. Those polemics follow from the positive ideas. The most central idea is logical probability, that the relation of evidence to conclusion is a logical one. The main founder of that idea was John Maynard Keynes, best known as an economist. He started out with a book on probability before he went on to an easier topic. Other notable defenders were Rudolf Carnap and E.T. James, and much the same idea is recently popular among some statisticians under the name objective Bayesianism. The point of that idea is that whether a theory is supported by evidence or not it's not itself a scientific discovery, but it's prior to science. It's like logic in mathematical reasoning, something absolutely objective and the standard by which you judge other theories. It has nothing to do with science. It's the same across evidence in law, like proof beyond reasonable doubt, in the evaluation of historical theories, in detective work, medical diagnosis and so on. Anywhere where you have data, evidence, observations that support or don't support, as the case may be, some theory or hypothesis. Also, obviously, logical probability is fundamentally important to nearly all our thinking. It follows that deductivism, the thesis that there is no such logical relation, and hence that the only logic is deductive logic, is very corrosive of rationality. Well, let's say corrosive of virtually all rationality outside pure mathematics and logic itself. If you start thinking that way, you'll soon be claiming that if theories aren't maintained because there are good reasons for them, they must be maintained for political reasons like patronage or state propaganda, or maybe psychological ones such as ego defences or whatever is the latest. Now, Karl Popper in his book The Logic of Scientific Discovery and Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions did hold deductivism, and so in effect concluded that science could never genuinely advance through the accumulation of evidence. Those two books dominated philosophy of science in the mid and late 20th centuries. That's why Stowe wrote Popper and After Four Modern Irrationalists, to explain where they'd gone wrong. It would be a pity if we missed the fact that Stowe's prose can be very funny. Here is a comment about Popper, at one point talking about the soaring edifice of science, which he, Popper, thinks is really unsupported by evidence. So Popper has written a book called The Logic of Scientific Discovery, saying that really there is no logic of scientific discovery. Stowe compares that to Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes, where the fox can't reach the grapes and says they must be sour. Stowe says this. So it's all very well to say that, logical probability exists, but we won't understand how to actually determine if theories are well supported unless we understand what the principles of logical probability are. There are two basic principles. They're easy to understand and they're very intuitive, but as Stowe pointed out, have a strangely low profile in discussions of rationality. They're the confirmation of theories by their consequences and the proportional syllogism. Let me explain them. Confirmation by consequences. Well, it just says that if a theory has consequences, and those consequences are found to be true, then the theory is confirmed, meaning it's more probable than it was to begin with. Not many people have talked about that principle explicitly, but George Polya rightly called it fundamental inductive pattern. So the detective reasons that if the butler did it, the knife should be behind the sofa. The knife is found behind the sofa, so the theory that the butler did it is more probable. Einstein's general relativity predicted hitherto unexpected bending of light from distant stars. They went out to West Africa and observed it, so relativity was confirmed. And as in these cases, it's initially unlikely predictions that best confirm theories. So does consequences mean predictions? Well, mostly it does. Consequences often means predictions. So it's a prediction of a theory. It's the consequence of the theory in the case of the data that you're going to observe, but not always. For example, if a conjecture in pure mathematics implies some known result, that confirms the conjecture. And it's very interesting that the principles of logical probability apply in pure mathematics, which shows how much they are a matter of logic. They're nothing to do with uniformity of nature or anything like that. We're at a much deeper and more logical level than any scientific facts. Well, the second principle is the proportional syllogism, also called the statistical syllogism or direct inference. Stowe especially called attention to its neglect. The word syllogism refers to the form of deductive inference known since the ancient Greeks. It's like this: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The example is an ancient one, because philosophy takes pride in being a hidebound and traditionalist discipline. If you know the two premises are true, it follows with certainty that the conclusion must also be true. So far, so simple. Now, what about this apparently quite similar argument? Well, it's called proportional because it argues from a proportion in a population, but the proportion is less than 100%. Well, if you know the premises are true, it's certainly possible that the conclusion is false. So it isn't a deductive form of inference. Nevertheless, the premises provide good reason to believe the conclusion. Nearly all men are mortal. What could be better evidence that the particular one is? That sort of reasoning is everywhere in everyday life. Nearly all flights arrive safely, so you relax on takeoff. Most people with your disease improve with a certain drug, so you take it. Note that it doesn't say Socrates is a randomly chosen man or anything like that. Of course, if you have further evidence about Socrates, maybe such as he's a special friend of the gods, then it might not be reasonable to conclude that he's probably immortal. But that, of course, changes the premises. It adds in premises, so it's a different argument. It doesn't suggest that there's anything wrong with the original argument. The original argument just says respect the frequencies. If the great majority of something is such and such, expect that one of those things is that way. Especially interesting is the justification of deduction using the proportional syllogism. It was published originally not by Stowe, but in The Ground of Induction in 1947 by the American philosopher D.C. Williams, and defended by Stowe in The Rationality of Induction in 1986. The argument is this: the vast majority of large samples approximately match the population composition. That's a truth of pure mathematics. So the situation we're thinking of is something like a very large, like with thousands, a box with thousands of balls, black and white, of an unknown proportion. And it's a mathematical fact that most large samples, meaning not necessarily the whole, nearly the size of the population. Large means 500, let's say. And this is a large sample. You've got a large sample, therefore it matches the population, meaning probably. And that's the same thing as saying the population probably matches the sample. Again, match means approximately match. I'm thinking most people are thinking they're losing the track of it a little. It's something you can't get in a few seconds, and I can really only advertise it. That's a logical justification of induction, and it implies, for example, that induction works in all possible worlds, ordered or otherwise. Now, what about justifying hypothesis testing with p-values using a proportional syllogism? Interesting question. Well, that's all I wanted to say about those two particular principles. Those two principles fit into, those two principles, the confirmation of theories by their consequences and the proportional syllogism, fit into more general Bayesian and maximum entropy theory, which you can study if you want to become an expert in these matters. Finally, let me mention 3 of my books that arose from what I learned from Stowe. The first is, in the middle of the first book written, is The Science of Conjecture, Evidence and Probability Before Pascal. It's a history of evidence evaluation, uncertain evidence evaluation, before the mathematicians got onto the theory of dice in the 17th century. The central topic is the medieval law of evidence, where they developed concepts like modern proof beyond reasonable doubt, but it also has scientific theories, such as Galileo's thoughts on the probability of the Copernican hypothesis. Second book, What Science Knows and How It Knows It, is an overview of the rationality of science, starting with the rationality of induction, probability and other fields, plus some sceptical thoughts on the failures of what we might call actually existing science, their failures such as the refereeing process. The refereeing process has some positives, like giving people rude anonymous feedback that they wouldn't get from their lab assistants, but as people have said, that has its downside. David Stowe wouldn't have agreed with the third book, The Worth of Persons, The Foundations of Ethics, but it still owes a lot to him. It defends the absolute objectivity of ethics, comparing it to the objectivity of the relation of evidence to conclusion. Well, for more, I maintain a David Stowe website with many of his writings and reactions to them. Thank you. Talk to me later.
Listen, first of all, I'd like to thank Emily and Greg for the kind invitation to have me come here and share with you the recent work that we have done in our attempt to manage cancer. So I'll be talking today about cancer as a mitochondrial metabolic disease. and show you evidence that it cannot be what most people think, is that it's a genetic disease. And I'll show you the evidence, both theoretical and experimental. So, the way I like to begin my presentations on this subject is to always show you the report card, how we're doing in our attempt to manage cancer. So I've been accumulating this information for more than 15 years with the hope that we might be able to see at some point a drop in the number of people dying each year and each day in the United States from cancer. So these are the data from the American Cancer Society. Again, looking at 2013 to 2012. New cases, deaths per year. You get the number of deaths per day by simply dividing deaths per year by 365, and you get an estimate of how many might be dying each day from cancer. You'll notice there is a relentless increase in new cases. The numbers of people dying from cancer is pretty much similar to the population increase, which is about 5.2% over these same years in the United States. Of course, none of this is really super accurate. These are just estimates. The problem here, as you can see from looking at these numbers, we're not really making any major progress in dropping the number of people dying each day and each year from cancer. We raise all this money that you hear about, billions of dollars from the NIH, private foundations, and we don't seem to get any really big drop, right? I put there the pink ribbon, Susan Komen Foundation. You know, you put pink ribbons, people run, bike, CrossFit, I don't know what they do. Raising money to breast cancer, and the more money we raise for cancer, the more cancer we get. Susan Komen for breast cancer raises all this money, and breast cancer in women has now surpassed heart disease as the #1 killer of American women. Thank you, Susan Komen. Okay, this is another paper that we've mentioned before, some of the work from this group. The Food and Drug Administration has approved 92 drugs from 2000 to 2016. And as you can see, they've had only a marginal benefit in overall survival, which is ultimately what is the key. The key to knowing whether something works is whether or not it keeps you alive longer and quality of life. And what we're seeing here, for all the millions of dollars that we have spent on cancer drugs, we only see about a 2.4-month improvement in overall survival. Okay? And then what we know is from a number of these drugs is that you can also get hyperprogressive disease, which is not mentioned, but which means that if you take one of these drugs, there's a significant probability that you will die from the drug before the cancer kills you. Okay? And we also don't know, in any good statistical way, how many people are dying from the treatments rather than actually from the cancer. That's another piece of evidence that's blurred. We don't really know about that. What is going on? Why no progress? This is what I'm going to talk about. What causes a growth-regulated normal cell to become a growth-dysregulated cancer cell? Dysregulated cell growth is what we call what cancer is. And I'm going to show you evidence, hard evidence, that it's mitochondrial dysfunction or damage that leads to the origin of cancer. And in this little diagram of the cell, you see the mitochondrion, I've pointed out, and the nucleus. These are the two organelles within the cell that we need to focus on to better understand the origin of cancer. Cancer arises from damage to the respiration of the cell. That little bean-shaped organelle, the mitochondria, is responsible for us getting energy, so that every one of you looking at me can understand, or at least see that I'm here. Because without energy, nothing works. So that little organelle can be damaged from oncogenic viruses, radiation, carcinogens in the environment, hypoxia, chronic inflammation, rare inherited mutations. Whatever it is, there's a whole range of things that can chronically damage the ability of the cell to generate energy. When that damage happens, what's produced are ROS, reactive oxygen species. These are radical oxygen forms. They damage DNA, protein, and lipids. So what you see in the nucleus, somatic DNA mutations and most other abnormalities seen in cancer, are downstream effects of these ROS-induced damage to the nucleus. So the question we have to ask ourselves, should we be focusing on downstream phenomena or the actual origin of what caused the downstream problems? That's the key here. Again, we encapsulate our approach to managing or understanding nature by using theories. So the scientific theory is simply an attempt to explain the facts of nature. Reality is based on replicated facts, where the interpretation of the facts is based on credible theories. We can look back in history and we can see how these facts have been interpreted. The heliocentric theory of Copernicus, Galileo, and Kaplan could better explain the movement of celestial bodies than could the geocentric theory of Aristotle and Ptolemy. The germ theory of Louis Pasteur could explain better the origin of contagious diseases than could the bad air miasma theory of Hippocrates and Galen. The Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution by natural selection could better explain the origin of species than could the theory of special creation. What I'd like to introduce to you today is, can the mitochondrial metabolic theory explain better the origin and management of cancer than can the somatic mutation theory? We're going to now compare and contrast. I consider the last number 4 just as important to man's knowledge as the first 3, because it deals with life and death issues critically. So, what do we consider cancer today? Is a genetic disease. It's a current dogma. The dogma, as I told you, is a very powerful force on the brain. Consider political and religious dogma. We have dogma in science just as well. The gene theory of cancer is a dogma. Cancer is a genetic disease. Hanahan and Weinberg's paper is the most cited in the scientific literature. Over 76,000 times the hallmarks of cancer have been cited. Cancer cells carry the oncogenic and tumor suppressor mutations that define cancer as a genetic disease. No question. Irrefutable truth. It's in all the textbooks. Biochemistry, cell biology, you name it. Even from high school, through college, through medical school, cancer is a genetic disease. No other explanation. This has indoctrinated now generations of scientists and physicians. Okay, here's again from the National Cancer Institute webpage. First thing, how cancer arises. Cancer is a genetic disease that is caused by changes in genes that control the way our cells grow and divide. So again, we're solidifying the dogma. How do we do this? Somatic mutation theory. Mutations in genes that inhibit or stimulate cell division contribute to cancer. The definition of cancer is cell division out of control. That is the definition of cancer. We have 2 competing theories to explain this. One is the somatic mutation theory, and I will be describing the mitochondrial metabolic theory, and I'll leave it up to you folks to see what you think might be the right answer on this. So we have mutations in tumor suppressor genes and proto-oncogenes that lead to cell division out of control. We further say that somatic mutations, accumulation of random, remember random somatic mutations cause the development of a cancer cell. So you see the normal cell on the left here, and eventually one this mutation, that whatever it is, you eventually get a malignant cell growing out of control. And here's a quote from Dr. Vogelstein of Johns Hopkins University. We now know precisely what causes cancer. A sequential series of alterations in well-defined driver genes. We have a lot of passenger genes, and then we have these driver genes. Remember, so not all mutations are equally bad, but the drivers are considered the ones that cause dysregulated cell growth. And as a result of all this, we get personalized therapy. So where the somatic mutation theory has morphed, it's morphed into personalized therapy, precision medicine. You hear these terms, precision medicine. We know you're cancer, we have just a thing for you, blah, blah, you're on TV and all this stuff. So the woman is looking into the screen, looking to see if these breast cancer cells have extra copies of a particular gene. Maybe what they think, maybe it has some prognostic or therapeutic value, we don't know. The problem is when you take that tissue to get that information that that woman is looking at, you run the risk of inflammatory oncotaxis. When you stab a tumor or a piece of tissue, you change the microenvironment in that tumor. So what you're looking at on that screen may no longer be relevant to what's going on in the tissue that you took the information from. Besides, the information that she is looking at is largely irrelevant. I don't expect you to see this. But there's two things I want you to see. Cancer analysis, okay. Why I put this on here is because the conflict of interest statement is 3 times longer than the abstract of the paper. What is going on with that? That's all. A lot of conflict of interest. So the current dilemma is how can we advance new therapies for cancer management and prevention if the 800-pound gorilla thinks that cancer is a genetic disease? He says dogma rules. Who's controlling the dogma? National Cancer Institute and the American and pharmaceutical cancer industries. Okay, you're talking about bigger than an 800-pound gorilla. Okay, so what happens when you challenge the dogma? I don't want to look at it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. It upsets me. It makes me uncomfortable. And that's, so the bottom line, ignore it. That's what we do, we ignore it. Now let me run by you some evidence that I've collected over the years that challenges the somatic mutation theory of cancer. Theodore Bovary published an article in 1914 where he outlined his speculative idea that cancer may have something to do with abnormal chromosomes. But he made it very clear. He said, I know nothing about cancer. I'm an interloper. I'm just speculating. And probably everything that I'm telling people in that essay is probably wrong. Nevertheless, he's the father of the somatic mutation theory. He knew nothing about cancer. Now we have new evidence from genomic sequencing. We're not finding mutations in some cancer cells. This is very unusual, right? We talk somatic mutation, but we have some cancer cells that can't find any mutations. And now the latest information is coming out, cancer driver genes found in normal cells. What the hell does that mean? I just told you, driver genes are driving the dysregulated cell growth. So now we're taking tissue from young people and older people. Look at all the driver genes, and people never get cancer. How can you explain driver genes that don't form cancer? How can you explain cancer cells with no mutations? What do we do with evidence that doesn't fit the theory? Ignore it. Some carcinogens don't cause mutations, like asbestos. Doesn't cause mutations, but everybody knows asbestos causes cancer. Okay. We have our closest biological relative, the chimpanzee, similar to us at 98% protein and gene sequence. There's never been a documented case of breast cancer in a female chimpanzee. Okay? What's going on with that? Breast cancer is now overtaking heart disease and killing American women. The chimpanzee never gets cancer. What's going on? He's actually living in the same diet and lifestyle he did when he first evolved as a species. Also, Aboriginal tribes that we uncover, rarely do they have cancer. So they're living in diet and lifestyle issues that they had as their past. We know we can get metastatic cancer without mutations, and the nuclear mitochondrial transfer experiments put a nail in this coffin. And I'll talk about that in a minute as soon as I have a chance to move this. Okay, I wrote this paper in 2015 based on my chapter 11 in my book. Cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease. All I did was go back in the literature and reevaluate the data from all of these top quality developmental biologists, the best in the world developmental biologists. They were asking a question, can the nucleus of a tumor cell direct normal development? And it can up to a point. None of them were asking the question, do these data that I'm collecting influence whether we consider cancer a genetic nuclear mutation disease or a mitochondrial metabolic disease? Because they were all indoctrinated by the dogma. They didn't think about an alternative. So this is one of the most beautiful series of experiments because the experiments were done in an unbiased way. They weren't testing what I'm talking about. They were just asking whether a nucleus could direct normal development. And it could, as I said, up to a point. And then the organism would implode because of the genetic mutations in there. So If I don't have the time to go through all of the beautiful experiments to support what I'm saying, summarize this. This has been all over the web now by a lot of people. And I've put it, so you can see green cells beget green cells, normal cells give rise to more normal cells, and they are growth regulated. So green, they have normal genomes, they have normal mitochondria, give rise to regulated growth. The tumor cells beget more tumor cells that are dysregulated. We all know that there are mostly mutations in the nucleus, but the mitochondria are also defective. So is it the mutations in the nucleus, or is it the mitochondrial problems in the cytoplasm that's leading to dysregulated cell growth? So this has been addressed beautifully. So you take the nucleus from the tumor cell, put it in a new cytoplasm with normal mitochondria, and lo and behold, you get growth regulation, despite the continued presence of the mutations in the nucleus. On the other hand, if you take the nucleus from a normal cell and put it in the cytoplasm of a tumor cell, you either get dead cells or cells that are dysregulated in their growth, cancer cells. This has been done over and over again. Also, mitochondrial transfer experiments. Take normal mitochondria, put it in a tumor, you get growth regulation. These data say that it's not the nucleus, not the mutations that are causing the cancer. It's the defects in the mitochondria that are causing the cancer. You have to put these experiments together with all the other stuff that I just told you about. And anybody with any functional brain cells can see that it can't be a nuclear genetic disease. So if somatic mutations are not the origin, how do we get cancer? Where do they come from? Otto Warburg, the famous German scientist from the last century, said a long time ago, almost 100 years ago, cancer arises from chronic damage in cellular respiration. Breathing energy. Take a deep breath. Okay, oxygen comes in, and I'm able to speak, and I'm able to think, as much as I can. Energy, but however, what happens in the cancer cell is they replace energy through oxygen with energy through fermentation. Energy through fermentation is without oxygen. Cancer cells don't need oxygen, okay? If you have a tumor in the body and you drink cyanide, you're dead, but the tumor is still alive. These experiments have been done by Warburg and others. They don't need oxygen. Why? Because their cells have shifted from oxidative phosphorylation to substrate level phosphorylation, which is a fermentation mechanism that goes back to the earliest days of life on our planet, 2.5 billion years before oxygen came into the atmosphere. Cancer cells are simply falling back on ancient fermentation pathways. Now, of course, there was a lot of brouhaha about Warburg and all what he did, but there was confusion because we at Boston College have identified glutamine as the second major fermentable fuel. Everybody knows in the cancer field glutamine is a powerful driver of cancer, but they didn't know the mechanism. They assumed it was respired. No, glutamine is fermented. This fills the missing link in Warburg's central theory that cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease. Now, what we do know is that when you look at a tumor, every cell in that tumor has a different constellation of genetic mutations, but every cell in that tumor is a fermenter, okay? They're all fermenting, regardless of what their genetic profiles are. If we know that, we know how to kill them. Because there's only two fuels that the tumor cell can use to ferment, and it's the sugar glucose and the amino acid glutamine. Okay, what's the evidence of what I just told you, right? You look at the normal mitochondria. Beautiful stripes, electron micrograph. Look at those stripes, huh? They're loaded with the proteins and the lipids that drive oxidative phosphorylation so we can get energy from the oxygen that we take in. Here's a little, it tells you what the whole thing is here. Look at, they have no cristae in there. Structure determines function. How is it possible for this mitochondria missing the key elements necessary for oxphos? It won't be able to get oxphos because the cristae, the structures are not there. Okay, structure determines function. Look at, here's for breast cancer. Normal breast cell, beautiful stripes, cristae, breast tumor. Look at the vacuoles, disrupted cristae. And look at this colorectal cancer. All these are vacuoles, mitochondria that have no cristae. Structure determines function. It's an evolutionarily conserved process in general biology. Structure determines function. You see this. Now what I did is I went through all the major cancers. And I looked at what's killing about 85% to 95% of people are dying from these groups of cancers. And all of them have structural abnormalities in the mitochondria, the abnormalities in the number, structure, and function of the mitochondria. Meaning that none of these cancers are going to be able to generate energy through breathing oxphos. It's going to be fermented. They're going to have to ferment because the structures needed for oxphos are defective. And we can summarize it with this diagram right here, which is very clear. Here's a normal mitochondria with stripes. Most of our energy comes from oxidative phosphorylation. We get a little bit from these substrate level phosphorylation. But during the formation of a dysregulated tumor, OXPHOS is replaced by substrate level phosphorylation. I have all the pathways. I just didn't want to bore you with all the incredible evidence to support going from. And look at, here's the mitochondria of the tumor cell, missing cristae. You get a very close relationship between fermentation and malignancy. The more fermentation, the more malignancy. The more fermentation, the more malignancy. And they end up with very little OXPHOS, if any. So these guys are raging fermenters. Cancer cells are raging fermenters. They don't need oxygen for this. The other thing too is the mitochondria control the cell cycle. The mitochondria determine whether the cell should be quiescent or whether the cell should grow in a normal way. When that organelle becomes defective, these cells grow out of control. As long as they have fermentable fuels in the microenvironment to drive their proliferation, it's very hard to stop them. So if most cancer cells obtain energy through fermentation, then what therapies might be effective for managing and preventing tumors? One approach is reduce the fuel. Reduce the fuel and replace it with non-fermentable fuels, okay? Not that complicated. So here's an example of what we do. Okay, so we use diet therapies and lower blood sugar with calorie restriction, water-only fasting, restricted ketogenic diets. They will lower blood sugar, and as a conserved evolutionary conservation, when you stop eating, you start mobilizing ketone bodies, fats, adipocytes, and you raise these cancer cells can't use ketone bodies. You need a good mitochondria to burn ketone bodies and fatty acids. Tumor cells don't have that. So you lower the blood sugar, elevate the ketones, and the cancer cells now start to drop out. Grow very slow. We published the glucose ketone index calculator to allow cancer patients to know what they need to do to get into the zone where they put pressure on the survival of their tumor cells. So if you have numbers of 2.0 or below, you're starting to put tremendous pressure on the availability of those cells to use one of their two key fuels, which is sugar, glucose. So you lower, the cancer cell needs glucose, can't grow very well without it. You gotta lower the glucose, and then force feed it ketone bodies, which you can't use. We built the outline of our new strategy for managing cancer. This is called the press pulse therapy. What we do, in this case, the cancer patient comes in, he has cancer, diabetes, has all kinds of other things. We immediately look at the blood work, bring that patient as best we can back into metabolic homeostasis using a variety of different glucose lowering diets and things, okay? We also manage stress management. People are freaked out with cancer, their blood sugar goes up, they get all depressed and everything. You gotta manage that to keep the sugars down. Then once the patient starts to get into the zone, we then hit them with very low doses of non-toxic drugs that further put pressure on glucose and glutamine, the only two fuels driving the beast. We use hyperbaric oxygen. And hyperbaric oxygen can replace radiation by increasing ROS in tumor cells. So we move the patient from a state of sickness to a state of management. Okay, in that managed state, now we have a chance, because the tumors are growing slower, we have a chance to strategize how we can get rid of them. Okay? And eventually, we either maintain long-term management with a good quality of life, or even possible resolution, which I'll show you evidence for. And here's the situation. To improve this, to make it work for the majority of people, it's basically dosage, timing, and scheduling of these different combos to work this out for the best. This is not sexy science. NIH doesn't fund this stuff. It's not sexy, but it keeps people alive. And I don't consider anything wrong with that. Now here's a direct example of, I have this paper now under review for publication. This dog was a pit bull. At 7 years old, it had a mast cell tumor, a malignant mast cell. They have all the same kind, very similar kinds of mutations that you see in some human tumors. The dog was eating Old Roy dog food, developed a mast cell tumor. The pet parent said, oh, I'm going to give the dog a vegan diet, raw vegetables. After 2 years, the tumor exploded to a much bigger tumor, scratched her head and said, you know, where does this dog come from? Comes from the wolf. What do wolves eat? They eat meat. So she immediately transitioned the diet away from raw vegetables to chicken with the bone in it, or fish oil, raw egg, cut the calories down, did exactly what we've done in the mouse for a long time. And lo and behold, this big ass tumor became a spot, a little black spot. Here's his face, here's the dog, see him, there he's got the face, here's his nose, here's where the tumor used to be. Now, what's interesting about this, this dog, just in a few months, this thing disappeared. The dog died at 15 years of age, longer than most pit bulls, from heart failure. The tumor never came back, okay? So I could go for hours on the mechanisms by which all this happened, but this is the evidence. The evidence is the dog was resolved of his aggressive tumor. And the patient, the owner of the dog said, I don't want my dog to get chemo and radiation, which is going to cost $10,000 to make the dog sick. The dog did not use chemo and radiation, only a raw meat diet. Now let's talk about humans, okay? This is the tumor that we've been focusing on, glioblastoma, very deadly human cancer. Median survival, which is very important, 10 to 15 months, and I have other things in there that are not quite as important, but they are when you have this tumor. Now we go to the next one here. Okay, here's an example of what this horrible tumor is. You can see it all discoloration, midline shift, causes intracranial pressure. Intracranial pressure is what kills most of the folks with glioblastoma. The tumor cells invade through the entire neural parenchyma. They use blood vessels as a tract system. They go along these darker purple cells here, darker purple, are around blood vessels. So the tumors seed the entire cortex, so that's why you can never surgically cure GBM, because the tumors are already out there. And what they continue to do, despite all the evidence that I said not to do, they give Avastin. Avastin is supposed to block blood vessels. Tumors don't care, they move right through. In fact, the more Avastin you give, the more infiltration you get through the brain. Can you believe this? Yeah, they do that. Avastin, crazy stuff. Now, this is an interesting thing in relationship to what we heard earlier from Greg and others. The irreproducibility of science, right? Science can't be reproduced? Wrong, not always. There's nothing more reproducible than how fast people die when they're treated with the standard of care. This is the results of 5 independent surgical institutions from Canada. And I have the same survival curves from our institutions, Dana-Farber, MD Anderson, Sloan Kettering. You got the same thing. In Japan, Germany, England, the best of my words, you're going to get a profile that looks like this. Okay, no improvement in 100 years. Right? Think about that. We have the Webb telescope, 1 million miles from Earth, circling, getting us to look for the very origins of our universe. And yet we've made no improvement in glioblastoma in 100 years. What the hell is going on with that? Can you believe it? Okay, I'll tell you what happened. Okay, when somebody is diagnosed with glioblastoma, we cut it out, and then as soon as the patient recovers from the cutting, the debulking, we then irradiate the guy's brain, which creates massive elevation of blood sugar. And because the brain swells from the radiation, we give the guy high-dose steroids, which also create hyperglycemia. And when we irradiate the brain, we break the very sensitive glutamine-glutamate cycle, which is a part of our neurons and glia, freeing up massive amounts of glutamine to feed the beast. And not only that, about 80% of these tumors are laced with human cytomegalovirus, which is like a turbocharger for the tumor cells to use glucose and glutamine. Okay? And this is all documented. I wrote article after article after article describing the molecular mechanisms by what's going on inside this guy's head when you treat him with standard of care. Okay, here it is again. Over and over again, we get the same results. What did Einstein say? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome, is insanity. Why does this not change? How many people have died as the result of this absurdity and continue to die? So, to test the hypothesis, If we say that glucose and glutamine are the two fuels that drive the beast, why don't we design an experiment to test the hypothesis that if we simultaneously target the two fuels, we will be able to significantly improve overall survival. So we developed the best animal models of glioblastoma. We do it in the animal model first, and then we can go to the human. So we use the drug 6-deoxynorlucine, which is a glutamine targeting drug, and we give the animals a calorie-restricted ketogenic diet to lower the blood sugar. So we lower the blood sugar, bringing down glucose. We elevate ketones to protect the normal cells, so they're neuroprotective, and then we give them pulse of dawn, which targets the glutamine. So I'm not going to, I have beautiful biochemical hard evidence, but I'm just going to show you the final result to test the hypothesis. So the blue line are the animals that ate the high-carb diet with no treatment. So they die real quick. You can see how fast they go. Okay, the ketogenic diet by itself did include a modest level of improvement, but you're not targeting the glutamine with the ketogenic diet. The drug, DON, had also some level of improvement, but you're not targeting the glucose with the DON. When you add the diet with the drug, you get really good survival. And we're pushing this way out now, way out. And we're going to test it in humans, and we're starting to see very similar kinds of responses, even more spectacular than the mice. Humans are much better to use these metabolic therapies than the mouse. The mouse's basal metabolic rate is 7 times faster than that of the human. Okay, they eat 20% of their food a day. Can you believe body weight? 20% of their body weight in food a day. You know, we have so much more flexibility to make this work in humans than in the mouse. So our first attempt was this guy from Egypt, a guy with a glioblastoma, corn farmer. He comes in, my good colleague, I work with El Saka, Dr. El Saka. So he calls me up and he said, we got a patient, let's do this press pulse on him. I said, fine. So we gave him some fasting and keto. He had an awake craniotomy to debulk the tumor. We kept him on for another 3 weeks, restricted diets. You know, we weren't really hitting glutamine too hard, but he was doing good. We kept pushing off the radiation. So he says, El Saka calls me up and he says, we got to irradiate him now. I said, why? He said, oh, we have to do it. Standard care says you must irradiate everybody. I don't give a damn, is it in the United States, or Egypt, wherever it is, we got to irradiate every cancer patient, brain cancer. So he took all the radiation and the temazole. He did pretty good. Went back out, started working in the field. We published the paper, all excited. So El Saka calls me up and he says he's got headaches now at 29 months following diagnosis, and he dies at 30 months. So they did an autopsy on his brain, and what they found, he died from radionecrosis brain liquefaction. So provocative question, should the ketogenic metabolic therapy replace the standard of care? In my opinion, we're not going to move the needle on these GBM patients until we abandon the radiation to the brain. Why is that so hard to understand? So we use examples. Brittany, okay, a beautiful young lady here, diagnosed with low-grade tumor in early January of 2014. Within 2 weeks, it exploded into a glioblastoma, inflammatory oncotaxis. So here's her with her husband. She starts the standard of care. I want you to look carefully. Here she is here before the treatment. Here she is after or while she's being treated. You see the puffy face? That's called moon face from elevated levels of steroids. You give the steroids, you get a consequence of moon face, indicates that her blood sugars are very, very high. Well, she knows the outcome. She decides to take her own life. Death with dignity, big article in People magazine. I'm going to kill myself rather than go through the standard of care. Okay? That's pretty bad when your patients would kill themselves rather than take your treatment. But that's what happened. Now this little guy is Danny Sheen. Danny was diagnosed with pineal, which is a childhood glioblastoma, in 2017. And Danny passed away in 2021. But look at Danny's face. You see how puffy it is? Here he is with his favorite toy. He died a week after this picture. This is a tragedy. This should not happen. We are working now with support from the British Childhood Cancer Fund to, we have a diet drug therapy that will allow these kids to live a far longer high quality of life. We collected the data now. And it's going to be a crime if they don't use that. And here's Pablo Kelly from Devon, England. He was diagnosed the same time as Brittany. He wanted no radiation, no chemo. Oh, you're going to be dead, Pablo, in 9 months. He has a story. You could read it in all these British newspapers and things. He doesn't want any of that. He's, I'm going to take my risk. So he goes on metabolic therapy, and 3 years, he's still alive in 3 years, but his tumor is there. It's not gone. It's still growing, but it's very much more indolent than it was. So he gets it debulked in 2017. He thought he was out of it. He goes back eating a few more carbs. All of a sudden, we see the images on the MRI go up. Oh, it's Pablo. Boom, he goes right back. And I have 5 years of daily glucose ketone monitoring from Pablo. It's published in the paper. You can read it in this paper. You see all the data that we have. And back down comes the tumor, managed. So he's had another debulking. But in the time from diagnosis, he's over 8.5 years out now. He's got married and he's had 2 kids, and he's still getting on with his life. We didn't cure Pablo, but Pablo is living a hell of a lot longer than he would have if he did standard of care. I don't know if there's what's wrong with that. You're giving him all kinds of grief. They're making it sound like I'm the bad guy. Now, you say, well, what about other cancers? Well, we published this paper on a guy with lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, very deadly. Went to the guy's liver and brain. My colleague, Even Julio from Greece, he's got this guy out 9 years. He should have been dead a long time ago. Here's one from triple-negative breast cancer. This woman was given, from Cleveland, Ohio, she was given 1 month to live. She took all kinds of radiation and chemo. They said, there's nothing more we can do, like they always say. So she goes to my colleague's clinic in Istanbul. They give her, she almost died in the emergency from the travel from Cleveland to Istanbul, almost killed her. She had to be resuscitated in the emergency room for 2 weeks. Finally, she gets out, and they do a modified ketogenic diet. And last year, we got pictures of her with her husband in Hawaii, loving life. Anecdotal, right? It's a fluke. It's a fluke. It's a fluke. N of 1, right? N of 1. You put parachute on a guy. 100 guys jump out without the parachute. 1 guy has the parachute. N of 1. Got to do double blind crossover to make sure it's real. And then I wrote this thing on prostate cancer. So why are we using chemical castration and all this crazy shit? I mean, you can get really good evidence with metabolic therapy. This is in nature, right? Everybody likes to ignore everything. So what we have here is GBM and other stage 4, what we call terminal cancer, should not be considered terminal if treated with ketogenic metabolic therapy. Standard of care is the dark side. Pablo Kelly is the bright side. So we published this paper. Can the mitochondrial metabolic theory of cancer explain better the origin and management than can the somatic mutation theory? So I kind of was very provocative in showing that the geocentric theory that people struggled with for a long time, and look at all the crazy elliptical things that they try to put together when the Earth was the center of the solar system. When you put the sun in the center, everything makes sense, right? So you put the mitochondria in the center of the cancer problem, and everything's going to make sense. We won't be lost with all the immunotherapies, Keytruda, Opdivo, CAR-T immunotherapies, or all this kind of stuff. I don't know anybody who's died from ketogenic metabolic therapy. Most cancers, including glioblastoma, is a mitochondrial metabolic disease. Cancer is not a genetic disease. Get over it. It's a reliance on substrate level phosphorylation, and I have all, and if you read my papers, I have all the hard evidence to support that. The simultaneous restriction of glucose and glutamine while under nutritional ketosis can help manage most, if not all, cancers. The press pulse metabolic therapy is a non-toxic, cost-effective strategy for the possible management of most cancers, especially glioblastoma and some of these other cancers that are really bad. Right? And we're starting a global society for metabolic therapy. I've got folks, really good physicians and scientists in numbers of countries that all want to get on board and say, how do I do this? What am I going to do? There's also a documentary film coming out for the stuff that we developed at BSI, showing how many people are surviving. It's It's not just a few flukes that I've shown you. Maggie and Brad Jones are collecting dozens and dozens of people that should have been dead, and they're alive, and they're appreciative of their life. And then, well, how do we get money to do what I do? Well, I get it mostly from foundations and philanthropy, okay? Travis Foundation of Metabolic Cancer Therapies, George Yu, Joe Maroon, Edward Miller, the Kenneth Rainin Foundation, Greg was so kind, and with the CrossFit organization, Children with Cancer United Kingdom, the Corkin Family Foundation, Bob Kaplan, my own university, the Oral Academy, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. How do I follow that? I think I'll just I've treated a patient too, they got better and everything. I've got a little strip off, because this is a t-shirt that Greg gave me 4 years ago when I got booted off Wikipedia. I can't read it anymore. I said that would happen. So, yeah, you think getting cancelled is a COVID thing? I was getting cancelled years ago. I was cancelled, and now, oh, what's this thing? Right, which I need. Right, I've got 2 minutes to do my presentation. We're about to enter the outer limits. People remember this? Well, I was managing to do real clever things with the presentation, but then we go, does that? Well, that's scary. It's so scary that we even have William Shatner. I'm scared. There's not much scary as him, is there? So, no, I just want to kind of get you thinking, get you out of your comfort zones. You're already out of your comfort zones, I think, from what we've heard already. Next slide. Blue pill, red pill. We've all seen this one. Blue pill, red pill. Which one makes you go into the strange world where we're all harvested for electricity? Or whichever one it is. A lot of people don't want to be harvested for electricity, or they don't want to know they're being harvested for electricity. So they're quite comfortable. Getting people out of the comfort zone, I think, is the hardest trick that we've got here. Because, people like to feel they're being protected. They like to feel that what's happening is all big grown-up people looking after them. Once you become a big grown-up person, you realise we're not really grown up at all. And you shouldn't rely on me to look after you. Next slide. But let's start by saying Western medicine is miraculous. This is a diagram from sometime in the mid-18th century. This is how to amputate old style. What I have to say is, if you amputated like that, there would be a lot of blood around, so this must be a dead person amputating like that. But no, I mean, can you imagine? Next slide. They said, during the 19th century, hospitals are known as the gateway to death, and medical students crowded into large halls to watch patients suffer. I mean, what is going on here? We have somebody, I don't quite know what the guy is doing with his arm, because it looks like it's, I have no idea what he's doing. What's the guy doing at the back? Is he vaping? It's just the expression as well. It's like, okay, next slide, please. This is called Robert Liston, the fastest knife in the West. Before anaesthetics became available, amputations happened when patients were awake and could feel the pain of the surgery. Can you imagine? Doctors who remove limbs the quickest were most popular, and Robert Liston, a Scotsman like myself, he gained the record for amputating a leg in 30 seconds. I mean, 30 seconds, it's going. So he's the fastest knife in the West End, and he ran the surgery in London. And the first anaesthetic was used in 1846. On one occasion, he was so quick to amputate the leg, he chopped off his patient's testicle as well. I mean, okay, he was quick, but he wasn't very accurate, was he? And during the surgery, he gained a 300% mortality rate because he accidentally cut off 3 of the fingers of his assistant. The spectator was frightened to death, and he died when Liston wielded his knife back. I'm assuming he was like wiping it like this, and the patient, the spectator, sort of fell down dead from the shock. So he killed the patient, his assistant, and a spectator. So that's how medicine was. It wasn't good. Next slide, please. So we have anaesthetics, hooray! We have sterile operating techniques, hooray! We've got antibiotics, thank God. So, things might not be great now, but you really didn't want to have yourself operated on 200 years ago. Next slide, please. So nothing is perfect, I'm aware of that. Click on it, it's just, there's no perfect system. And click on it again. Personal bias and beliefs have been there ever since we've started medicine. And again, so we can go back one. The things that we've done that have been really stupid. Miasma. The infection is spread by nasty smells. Removal of the toxic colon, commonest operation in the 1920s. Whatever your symptoms were, they remove your toxic colon. Radical mastectomy, tonsillectomies, strict bed rest following a heart attack. This must have killed hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions. Next slide, please. And this is like plague is transmitted by unpleasant smells. So you can imagine you're feeling pretty ill, and someone says, the doctor's coming. There's a knock on the door, and it's like, oh, God! This is what they look like. So you think you've got PPE nowadays. This is PPE, proper old style. There's a leather coat, there's gloves, there's goggles of some sort, and a stick to beat people away with. I quite fancy one of those. Just go out of the room. You're annoying me. This is my bedside manner, but it must be better than this guy. Yeah. The mask had holes into which was placed theriac and or nutmeg. Now nutmeg was placed into the mask. It was believed that nutmeg's smell prevented you from dying of the plague or catching the plague. There's 2 islands where nutmeg was produced in the Philippines, and the Dutch and the British fought a war for 100 years over nutmeg. And in the end, the British said, you can have these 2 little islands, and we will have New Amsterdam. So Britain took over New York, and that's why you're speaking English in this country, rather than Dutch. All because of this thing, theriac. I've never heard of it. Next slide, please. Theriac. This was preventive medicine for 2,000 years, based on mithridatism. Mithridatism being you take a small amount of something, and you will gain resistance. You get immunity. Theriac was hugely expensive. This is where Newton, whatever it came from Shakespeare. They used to make this stuff, and it was enormously expensive. And it contained hundreds of different things. And people took it, and they paid a fortune for it. Now, nowadays, you'd be putting a statin, and a blood pressure lowering agent. A small dose of poison to build up immunity. How does that sound? Well, at the time when theriac went, late 17th century, along came vaccination and also homeopathy. You take a small amount of something, and that protects you in the future. So it's interesting. The transformed idea, because no one had any idea why a vaccine would work when it first came out, or even if it did. Next slide, please. So how I used to be like this as a doctor, I was happy. Medicine was going smoothly, it was a great thing, I was doing a great thing, and I was curing people, and everything was fantastic. Next slide, please. How I am now. Because it's kind of gone a bit, really. Next slide, please. So my overhead pill, this starts with, is from Alice in Wonderland, which is one of my key texts that I use to understand medicine. I particularly like this one. It is, can you do addition? What's 1 and 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 1? And I don't know, said Alice, I've lost count. Now, that's something I'm going to say a couple more times. I've lost count. A lot of the stuff that we see now is because people have just lost count. Next, click. Michel de Montaigne, never heard of him, a French philosopher. In fact, the father of the essay, he wrote essayer, to try in French, and he was the first essayist in the world. Difficulty is a coin the learned make use of, like jugglers, to conceal the inanity of their art. It's also something that pharmaceutical companies do to conceal the inanity of their art. Next slide, please. This is where I started off. You think this hotel's posh? You want to try this one. This hotel's so posh, Americans come and stay in it. It's Scotland. And it's got about 800 golf courses, and it's got Princess Anne's got stables there, it's got croquet on the front lawn, if you've never played croquet. And I went there on a freebie from a pharmaceutical company. Yes! These were happy days. and at that conference, they came up with the, next slide please, the MRC trial, Medical Research Council. This is the first trial on lowering moderately raised blood pressure. Prior to this, no one had ever done such a study, and in fact the MRC was set up to do this. And we were there, and we were going to be presented with the glorious results of this trial. Next click is the primary results. Next one. The stroke rate was reduced. 60 strokes occurred in the treated group, 109 in the placebo group. I'm going to say after 17,354 participants. No difference in coronary events, 220 events on active treatment, 234 in the placebo group. And there was no difference on mortality from all causes. This is the number one thing. You can misdiagnose all sorts of things, but you can't yet misdiagnose whether somebody's dead. This is the critical thing. Next point, please. There were 248 deaths in the treated group and 253 in the placebo group. Now, yes, we know it's not statistically significant, but I just thought for my life, for a bit of amusement, we have here a trial lasting 17,354 patients over 5 years. So there's 5 less deaths after 43,000 years of treatment, which is 8,600 years to prevent one death. So it's like saying to someone, giving them an antibiotic, well, I have to take this for 8,600 years. Sorry about that. This is a place in Turkey, it's a 9,000-year-old city that was being excavated. Well, if one of those people would still be alive if they had been started taking antihypertensive treatment at that time. Is that how statistics works? Next slide, please. If you've been at Stonehenge, you've still got another 3,000 years to wait, because this is a relatively new thing. Next slide, please. So this was everybody else at the meeting. They all sat there and they wrote it down and they all went, yep. And next slide. And this was me. Look again. I sat there and I thought, what? That's it? Come on. Next slide, please. So I started my little long and winding road. I know the CrossFit people here who see that long and winding road and go, yeah. And I'm more like, get me a bus and a beer. But, next slide, please. But once you've kind of woken up and taken the red pill, you come across stuff like this. This is much newer, by the way, but I find it quite amusing. Click on it, yeah. The United States long-standing vaccine safety program closely and constantly monitors the safety of vaccines. Fantastic. A critical part of the program, the Immunization Safety Office identifies possible vaccine side effects and conducts studies to determine whether health problems are caused by vaccines. Click on. One more click. Data show that the current US vaccine supply is the safest in history. Next one, next slide, and click on. And this was a letter sent to the CDC under Freedom of Information. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Anyway, they asked all documents in the CDC's possession which compare the health outcomes between children that have received vaccines and children that have never received any vaccines. So have you got any information, please? And this was the reply of the CDC. A search of our records failed to reveal any documents pertaining to your request. The CDC has not conducted a study of health outcomes in vaccinated versus unvaccinated populations. Next slide, please. Click on. What? I mean, come on. And what the red pill also gets you is, this is from the Daily Mail. We already had the Daily Mail. I love the Daily Mail. This is me. This is almost 4 years ago. The deadly propaganda of the statin deniers. These drugs do protect you from heart attacks, but as this devastating investigation reveals, thousands are now refusing them. Because of me, Dr. Malcom Kendrick, Dr. Zoe Harker, who can't come because she didn't get any vaccines, and Dr. Asim Malhotra, who decided not to join us in our libel suit. And our libel suit is still going on. And it will still be going on in 4 years. And I can't talk about vaccines because of this. Right, next slide, please. So my long and winding road, this is more my kind of long and winding road. You can get on a bicycle. It started with a diet heart hypothesis, which, as we all know, looks something like this. We have the eat well plate, otherwise known as the drop dead plate. We can see you can eat lots of bread and potatoes and whatever that's funny coloured stuff at the top, and vegetables and vegetables, wonderful carbohydrate. And you can't eat very much of anything else. I don't know why butter didn't get in the dairy section. But then we have a McDonald's cheeseburger, which is the most deadly thing known to man. But I'd like to point out that the McDonald's cheeseburger is primarily made of a bun. There's a bit of cheese on it, which you're allowed. There's quite a lot of vegetables and not much meat. So actually, I've decided that McDonald's hamburger is the eat well plate made real for us all. You think not. Next slide, please. So I started to look at this and thinking, this literally is bunk, isn't it? A guy I now know well, James Kaplan, wrote a book, Eat Your Heart Out, 1987. A controversial bestseller that exposes the healthy eating con, basically saying that the the idea that eating fat is bad for you is nonsense. Next slide, please. So this is what I now started to look at. I need to click on. My goodness. Deaths from heart disease across Europe. This figures all come from Europe. And as you can see, stop. The newborn is coming. As you can see, if you're going to die of heart disease, live in Russia, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, etc., ex-Soviet Union countries. As you move to Western Europe, the rates of heart disease fall and fall and fall. We now next look at energy from fat in the diet. Yes, thanks. And here we go, bang. Dark red countries eat the most fat of all the countries in Europe. And it's like, have a look at that and tell me that eating fat causes heart disease. Go on. This data comes from 20 years ago. The reason why is that they've stopped providing the data on fat and saturated fat intake in these statistics. You can't get it anymore. If you click on it, it's just showing, you have to go on a Wayback Machine to actually see this. Click on it, and then the next slide. I took out the data that existed and said, here are 10 countries. The 10 countries that eat the least saturated fat are Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, I don't quite know how Israel got into Europe. And the ones that eat the most saturated fat, which is Spain, Italy, UK, Switzerland, France. And if you see, you look at cholesterol levels on the right-hand side. By the way, these are the world measurements. The US uses a weird milligram per deciliter measure, which the rest of the world uses proper measurements. 200 in the States is 5.2 millimoles per litre. As you can see, if you ate less saturated fat, you tended to have lower cholesterol levels. As the more saturated fat, you tended to have higher cholesterol levels. But as you can also see, in Georgia, that had the least saturated fat and had the lowest cholesterol level, at a rate of cardiovascular deaths was 10 times that in France. 10 times as high. Saturated fat is obviously terribly bad for you. Next slide, please. And then in Scotland, where I graduated from, we had a review of this is all deaths, not just cardiovascular deaths, the things that mean you're most likely to die of anything in the next 10 years. So at the top, sorry it's a very complicated graph, at the top we have previous myocardial infarction. So unsurprisingly, if you've had a heart attack, you're quite likely to die. Next, plasma fibrinogen. I never heard of that, I've just written a book about it. Why does clotting cause you to die? Move down and you can see at number 5 is urine potassium, and the minus sign means that's protective. So having a high potassium intake is enormously protective, as protective as smoking cigarettes is damaging. How many people even have heard of this? You move further down and get to number 11, urine sodium, minus 11. In other words, having a high sodium intake is protective against dying. Get to number 21, total cholesterol. The NS means not significant. In other words, it could just be a chance finding, and then we talked all about probabilities and stuff. So essentially, this study, if we just click on, was done in Scotland, and this is the type of information I was looking at, going, what are we talking about here? Next slide. This next one is a real, the next bit. This is looking at 181 countries in the world. I think there's 189 countries in the world, and looking at the level of cholesterol versus the risk of death. The one on the left is for men, and the one on the right is women. So, as you can see, lots and lots of dots all over the place, but you can, if you're very clever, draw a line through them. And you can see that the line here is from, basically, the higher your cholesterol is, the less likely you are to die. And for men, that's quite a significant result. For women, it's an enormously significant result. Such that, weirdly, the line crosses 0 at 5.5. So according to this, if your cholesterol is above 5.5, which would be about 250, you'll come back to life. And so we'll have zombies wandering in the world with high cholesterol level, going, I feel all right. And then you go to your doctor and you go, well, you're looking all right. It's kind of surprising, but you probably need a statin. Next slide, please. And this is another really complicated graph, but it amuses me, because in the UK they've done this huge biobank study, and also a health survey, England, Scottish Health Survey, looking at things that cause you to die, in this case cardiovascular disease. And they're looking at the same things, and the figures are slightly different. So at the top we have HbA1c, which as you can see has a ratio of 3.86. In other words, that's pretty dangerous. You go down to self-reported cardiovascular disease. Surprisingly enough, if you've already got cardiovascular disease, you're more likely to die of cardiovascular disease. Whoopee. And you keep moving down, and we get to total cholesterol, all right? Total cholesterol per 1 millimole per litre increase, which is 32.84 milligrams per deciliter. And as you can see, as your cholesterol goes up, absolutely nothing happens to your risk of cardiovascular death at all. It remains exactly in the same place. So, as you can think, see, I ended up thinking the cholesterol hypothesis is bunk, which is why I end up with t-shirts like this. And next slide, please. But we're all asked to believe this, you know, and this is 2 + 2 = 5. 1984 is my other book, as I use a reference for medical medicine. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. Next one, please. And this is the kind of stuff we're supposed to believe. Natural herd immunity should not be used as a means of pandemic control. We should need to focus on using successful virus suppression strategies until we reach herd immunity with the new vaccines. In other words, vaccines are better at protecting you from a secondary infection than getting the natural infection. Now you can believe that if you want. I just looked at statements like that and thought, no. This is utter crap. Somebody just sent me something this morning saying that they've actually now admitted that if you're naturally infected, you are, I think, 3 times more likely to be protected against the next infection and become seriously ill at the time. Next slide, please. 2 + 2 = 5. Why does this happen? This is money. This is actually a guy called Sepp Blatter around the Federation of International Football Association, which was entirely corrupt, and everything was run by money. And if you wanted to have the World Cup in your country like Qatar, which is a great place to have a football World Cup, as we all know, it's a huge footballing tradition, and it's 150 degrees in the shade, and it's the summer, and it has no football stadiums, just a place for me. I know what you mean. But what is football? Just football. I know that Americans call it soccer, but you know, you're not actually kicking it in football in America. You're throwing. We should call it handball. Next slide, please. But this is just looking at the FDA. However, you would hope is not a corrupt organisation, and of course it's not. And Dr. Robert Califf was Obama's nominee for the head of the FDA. Next, click again. Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, he said, we've made an exhaustive vetting process to make sure he has no conflicts of interest. Next clip. My staff tell me they haven't found anything that would call into doubt your ability to lead the FDA. Click on this is Robert Califf, very happy, smiling. Next picture. Conflict of interest statement. This took me 5 seconds, by the way, to find this conflict of interest statement on it. Click again. And here's his conflicts of interest. Merck, Roche, Bayer, Janssen, Eli, Plan, Amylin, Novartis, I mean, you name a pharmaceutical company, he's been paid by them. Next click, please. So money, so again. My staff tell me they haven't found anything. Okay, next slide. Next clip. And the next one. This slide, I'm taking on the role of a small child, all right? And there's a woman taking on the role of Senator Lamar. Click. My staff tell me they haven't found anything that calls into doubt your ability to lead the FDA fairly and impartially, he said he. Yeah, right. Next slide, please. Again. And this is where we're at. This is Marcia Angel, who edited the New England Journal of Medicine for 20 years. She's written rather critical books. It's simply no longer possible to believe that much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. In other words, we can't trust anything anybody is telling us anymore. Just think about the implications of what that means. Next slide, please. And somebody's already talked about Richard Smith, who was the editor of the BMJ for about 15 years. Click on. The poor quality of medical research is widely acknowledged, yet disturbingly, the leaders of the medical profession are only minimally concerned and make no apparent efforts to find a solution. Next slide. The next one is Richard Horton. The case against science is straightforward, and much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Science has taken a turn towards the darkness. These are the editors of the biggest medical journals in the world. And here is Richard Horton. I don't know why he's holding a shoe. Perhaps we could give him the boot. Anyway, that's just I just made it up. I'm here all week. Next. We've already heard about Johnny and Alice, this is the most downloaded paper, so we don't need to go in and just click through. But basically, for many current scientific fields, claimed research findings are often simply accurate measures of the prevailing bias. It's more likely for a research claim to be false than true. And that's why most published research findings are less likely to be correct. So I use it. Next one, next slide. So I'll give you a concrete example. Thank you. That's concrete. Here's an example. All right, I'm going to talk about the very exciting pro-protein convertase sublytics kexin type 9 inhibitors. Of course, there will be a test. You'll be asked what that means. Basically, they lower LDL cholesterol by far more than statins, and they're injectable. And a statin in the UK costs about £40 a year. Click next slide. The PCSK9 inhibitors about 8,000 a year. Click on, which is 200 times as expensive. And therefore, click on again. Yeah. If the UK, if everyone taking a statin took these things, it would cost $80 billion a year, which is half of what it costs for the entire National Health Service. In the UK, in the US, it would cost about 800 billion a year. Next slide. And so, by the way, I just chose somebody with a stethoscope around their neck to say that's a doctor. I haven't got a stethoscope around my neck, but that's the uniform. So they did a trial. I mean, they actually did a trial on it. Efalucumab, Repatha is the brand name of the drug. Efalucumab, MAB at the end means monoclonal antibody. Means boy, you've no idea how expensive this is. Any drug ending in MAB. Landmark outcomes show that Repatha decreases LDL-C to unprecedentedly low levels and reduces the risk of cardiovascular events with no new safety issues. Fantastic. Click on. So, this is where we're coming to the 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 thing. As reported in Medscape, the study, which included more than 27,000 participants with CVD, had already received statins, showed that patients who received injections of Repatha had a 15% reduced risk for composite. What does that mean? You don't know, do you? Of MI, stroke, CV death, coronary revascularization, and unstable angina. 1 and 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 1. How many ones was that? No idea. What does that mean? And we have another thing. We have a key secondary endpoint. What's a key secondary endpoint? MI, stroke, and CV death. Next, click. The study showed not 5%, ladies and gentlemen, not 10%. A 20% reduction in risk for the evolocumab group. P 0.000000000. How many zeros is that? 1. Who cares? Next slide, please. Can you do the addition on this? This is where the trick is. It's all done in plain view. All these statistics are just junk. They're just made up stuff. It'd be like saying a combined endpoint of having a heart attack or a broken fingernail. Well, we found that it was reduced by 50%. There was no reduction in cardiovascular death, but the broken fingernail numbers were really high. When we added them together, we find we had a combined endpoint. It really made sense. Next slide, please. So this is what actually happened. This drug was licensed purely on its effect of lowering LDL bad cholesterol by 60%. We assumed this would reduce cardiovascular death. So there were no studies done before this drug was approved. Next slide, click on. And then was the Fourier study. Click on again. And for a key secondary endpoint, MI, stroke, CV death, click on. This study showed a 20% reduced risk reduction for the group. Click on. Myocardial infarction and stroke. Remember, this is important. You don't know why it's important. You're going to find out. Next, click. Repatha, overall mortality. This is the one that really matters. There was 426 deaths in the placebo group. Click on. How many deaths do you think there were in the Repatha group? 444. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is an elephant in the room. And it's standing right there and it's going, woo, woo, whatever noise elephants make. It's not an elephant, is it? You can't go, blah, blah, blah. But it's not an elephant, you see, because it's a non-significant element. It's not statistically significant, this element, so it's not actually there. And although there were more deaths, there weren't really more deaths. There was actually no more deaths. They didn't ignore that figure because we had a 20% reduction in something else. Next slide, please. Anyway, this is a slide of American people applauding. British people have got rubbish teeth. And we never get as happy about that Nothing makes us as happy as that. This is as happy as I get, really. And I look nothing like that. Anyway, what happened was, some people, when they started up this thing called restoring mortality data, and they look at trials and they say, let's have another look at them. So restoring mortality data in the Fourier trial in patients with cardiovascular disease. Next slide. So they re-looked at all the data. After re-adjudication, deaths of cardiac origin were numerically higher in the ipilimumab group. This is cardiovascular origin. This is a drug that's supposed to stop you getting cardiovascular disease, suggesting possible cardiac harm. Click on. At the time, the trial was terminated early, always a bad thing. There was a non-significantly higher risk of cardiovascular mortality was observed with ipilimumab, and this was numerically greater on our re-adjudication. In other words, the original trial did not pick up a lot of stuff. So they felt a complete restoration of the Fourier trial data, and it is required, because they've done what they can, but they don't have all the data. In the meantime, so clinicians should be skeptical. No, they should stop prescribing it. I did say when these drugs came out, if they reduce cardiovascular disease, then I'm going to change my mind about the LDL hypothesis. I haven't changed my mind. In the meantime, clinicians should be skeptical about prescribing it for patients with established cardiovascular disease. There were 113 deaths from cardiovascular disease in the arm, and 88 in the placebo group. Don't worry, that's all. You might think that's an elephant. It's a not statistically significant elephant. Elephant. It's something else. Just ignore it. Next slide, please. So there is a group called Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials group. The Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials initiative looks at trials that weren't completely published, or they were just abandoned, or they didn't publish them at all. Or they just said, we don't like the results of this, and no one's going to see it. And that has happened a lot of times. This is really an important thing that people are doing. That's why I applaud them for it. The next slide is a boring bit. This is the last one, on the last stretch. Don't worry, Emily. I know I've lasted. You told me I had 2.5 hours. I've only got another 52 slides. I could go on and on about this. Next slide, please. This is the Fourier reanalysis. This is where it gets absolutely critical. We were surprised to learn from our re-adjudication of Fourier that the cause of death was undetermined for more than 1/3 of all deaths. They didn't know what anybody actually died of. So, this is absolutely key. Similar unrecognized uncertainties probably apply to the apparent results of many other trials. In other words, we have a situation where people don't know what the participants in clinical trials are. Well, they know in some cases, but for a very large percentage, they have no idea what they're dying of. We were surprised to find no evidence that an autopsy was performed. They didn't do autopsies. And if you don't do an autopsy, how the hell do you know what somebody died of? For sure, you don't answer. Next. So the Fourier reanalysis, we found that there was 91 deaths, all right, were classified by the local investigator as undetermined. But they didn't stop and say, well, we don't know what they died of. What they found was that the Fourier Clinical Events Committee, anyone who suddenly died was put down as a sudden cardiac death, without any clinical evidence to support this change. They just said, well, it'll be cardiac. Now, if you could start making shit up, which is what this is called technically, you're just making shit up. And then you're publishing, and then the FDA had this data. And, anyway, it is misleading to categorize deaths of unknown cause as sudden cardiac because the latter term implies a relationship to acute myocardial infarction. In other words, you can't just make shit up. Because a Cochrane review looked at 1,000 sudden deaths and found that only 41% of them are actually due to myocardial infarction. So they made shit up, and they ignored other people's stuff. And then this thing has been launched as an effective way of preventing cardiovascular disease. A critically important error in the New England Journal of Medicine reporting Fourier is the adjudication of all sudden deaths as sudden cardiac death without supporting evidence. So they just made shit up. Next slide. And somebody else looked at PCSK inhibitors, all of the new ones, and ezetimibe, and said, do they actually work? They both lower LDL, so they should be causing great benefit. Next, click on. Ezetimibe or PCSK inhibitors may reduce non-fatal MI and stroke, but remember, all the trials made shit up. So we don't know if they do or not. But this is only at the very highest cardiovascular risk. But nothing, you can see nothing in those in moderate and low cardiovascular risk, which is almost everybody that will be taking these drugs. Next click. So basically, adding ezetimibe or PCSK inhibitor in statin intolerant, we now have all these statin intolerant adults because these drugs have gone around, had no significant effect on all-cause or cardiovascular mortality. No effect. And they're launched and they're out there. So what do we know? We know many trials are buried. I'm not going to talk about MCA because I don't have time. Next. We know that investigators are just making up causes of death. We know the FDA doesn't do its job. And we know that PCSK9 inhibitors make billions and will make many more. And I've just looked at the next slide. This is what we call a double-faced palm, which is worse than a single-faced palm. It's very bad. It's got a slap it as well. The United States, so I can't say that anymore. The current US market value for PCSK9 inhibitors is $3 billion a year. This is expected to go up to $13 billion a year in the next 10 years. It's a projected growth rate of 15.8% for a drug that kills people. Fantastic. We live in wondrous times, do we not? It's like, still, WebMD and others are going, what do you need to know about them? Well, I say, what you need to know about them is whatever you do, don't take them. But they're still saying PCSK inhibitors slash LDL levels by an average of 47%. Well, they do all that and they increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, and we still say that cholesterol and LDL causes heart disease. Come on. This protects your heart, even though they died. But it said reduce the risk of heart attack by 27%. Well, what is 1 and 1 and 1 and 1? And who knows it? How did they get that figure? Where did that one come from? Next slide, please. So you can understand how I am now. I don't smile much. I don't go out much. It's simply not possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. You don't say.
Yeah.
Final slide. Medical research is utterly and completely and irredeemable. Is it irredeemable? We're here. You know, we've been invited to start, hopefully we can start something. It looks, everybody else said we can't move this, we can't, it's impossible. And I say, well, at least we can have a go. You know. In the Middle Ages, they built cathedrals, and it took 300 years to build. And the people who were, putting the first bricks on didn't give up. They just said, well, I'm making this cathedral. So I think we have to look at it in terms of, it ain't going to change tomorrow, unless you give me a machine gun. Real quick. Or maybe the Ukrainians on side. And so I think we have to try, but at the moment we are in a terrible situation. And that is me. Thank you very much.